October 1865. A 21-year-old student walks into a second-hand bookshop in Leipzig. He's supposed to be studying theology and classical philology, but something pulls him toward a table stacked with forgotten volumes. His hand lands on a thick book with a worn spine, The World as Will and Representation by Arthur Schopenhauer. He opens it randomly, reads a few lines, and something shifts inside him. He'll later describe this moment as if lightning had struck him. Friedrich Nietzsche buys the book with money he doesn't have. He takes it back to his room and reads through the night, then the next night, then the next. He'll say that every line spoke to him as though written for him alone, as if Schopenhauer were addressing him personally across the decades. This is no ordinary philosophical interest. This is conversion. But here's what makes this moment strange. Schopenhauer has been dead for 5 years. He died in 1860, largely ignored by academic philosophy, convinced the world had failed to recognize his genius. And he was right about the recognition part, just wrong about the timing. By the time Nietzsche discovered him, Schopenhauer was becoming a cult figure among artists and intellectuals who felt alienated from the optimistic spirit of the age. Wagner adored him, so did Tolstoy, though for different reasons. The pessimist philosopher was having his posthumous moment. Nietzsche threw himself into Schopenhauer's world with the intensity of first love. He read everything. He convinced his friends to read everything. He structured his entire worldview around Schopenhauer's central insight, that beneath the surface appearance of things, beneath all our rational explanations and comfortable illusions, there churns a blind, meaningless force Schopenhauer called will. Not will as in decision-making, but will as the fundamental drive of existence itself. Hunger without purpose, desire without end, suffering built into the fabric of reality. For young Nietzsche, this felt like truth. Finally, someone had the courage to say what others only whispered. Life is suffering. Desire creates suffering. Satisfaction of desire is temporary, creating only new desires, more suffering, round and round, forever. The whole human project, all of civilization, all of history, just the will, using us for its own pointless reproduction. Nietzsche became Schopenhauer's apostle. In his letters from this period, he quotes the master constantly. When he gets his first academic position at Basel at the impossibly young age of 24, his early lectures are soaked in Schopenhauerian pessimism. His first book, The Birth of Tragedy, is dedicated to Richard Wagner, but philosophically belongs to Schopenhauer. The framework is pure Schopenhauer, art as temporary salvation from the will, tragedy as the highest art form because it reveals life's essential suffering without flinching. But something's already changing. You can hear it in the way Nietzsche talks about tragedy. For Schopenhauer, the point of tragedy is to show us the futility of willing, to push us toward resignation, toward quieting the will. But Nietzsche keeps circling back to the Greeks, to how they faced the horror of existence and somehow said yes to it anyway. They didn't resign, they created, they celebrated, they turned suffering into beauty not to escape it but to affirm it. This is the crack in the foundation. Nietzsche doesn't see it yet, or maybe he does and can't admit it. He's still signing his letters as Schopenhauer's devoted student. He's still recommending the master's books to everyone he meets, but the tension is building. By the mid-1870s, Nietzsche starts using a new phrase in his notebooks, "we who think differently." He doesn't name names yet, but it's clear who he's thinking differently from. Schopenhauer taught him to see through illusions, to reject easy optimism, to face the darkness. But what if Schopenhauer himself had created a new illusion? What if pessimism, resignation, the denial of life? What if that was just another comfortable lie? The break comes slowly, then all at once. Human, All Too Human, published in 1878, contains no dedication to Wagner, no homage to Schopenhauer. Instead, it's a systematic dismantling of everything Nietzsche had believed. Metaphysics, an error, the will, a fiction, resignation, weakness disguised as wisdom. The book reads like a divorce proceeding, methodical and cold. Nietzsche will spend the rest of his productive life defining himself against Schopenhauer. Not just disagreeing, but inverting almost every major position. Where Schopenhauer saw a cosmic will to live that creates suffering, Nietzsche will posit a will to power that creates meaning. Where Schopenhauer prescribed resignation, Nietzsche will demand affirmation. Where Schopenhauer offered compassion as the basis of ethics, Nietzsche will call compassion a disease. But here's the paradox that haunts everything that follows. Nietzsche learned how to philosophize from Schopenhauer. The ruthless honesty, the willingness to follow ideas to uncomfortable conclusions, the psychological insight, the brilliant prose, the contempt for academic philosophy's evasions. All of this Nietzsche absorbed from the master he would reject. Even Nietzsche's famous aphoristic style owes a debt to Schopenhauer's essays. More than that, they shared enemies. Both despised Hegel and the German idealist tradition. Both rejected Christianity while taking it seriously as a psychological and cultural force. Both saw through the pretensions of their age. Both positioned themselves as lonely truth-tellers against comfortable delusions. They were allies in the war against optimism, against progress, against the idea that history has a purpose or that reason rules the world. So when Nietzsche attacks Schopenhauer, he's attacking his own past self. He's attacking the seductive appeal of giving up, of saying the world is too terrible to affirm. And maybe he's attacking something deeper, a temptation he felt in himself, the pull toward resignation that he had to resist every day. The apprentice and the master, the disciple and the prophet, the son and the father. All these metaphors fit, and none of them quite capture it. Because Nietzsche didn't just learn from Schopenhauer and move on. He built his entire mature philosophy as a sustained response to Schopenhauer. Every major work, every key concept exists in dialogue with the pessimist philosopher who grabbed a young student's imagination in a Leipzig bookshop. Without Schopenhauer, there is no Nietzsche. But Nietzsche's entire project is to prove Schopenhauer wrong. This isn't just philosophical disagreement. This is something more intimate, more urgent. This is a fight over whether life deserves a yes or a no. Arthur Schopenhauer was born in 1788, which means something specific. He came into a world where the French Revolution's promises were fresh, where Napoleon was still rising, where everything seemed possible and terrible at once. By the time he was writing his masterpiece in his 30s, Europe had exhausted itself with war. The Congress of Vienna had tried to put everything back the way it was. The revolutionary energy had curdled into reaction. He watched Napoleon's armies march through his hometown of Danzig. His family fled. He saw what happens when grand ideas about human progress meet reality. He saw the bodies. He saw the collapse of the rational Enlightenment dream into blood and empire. And he concluded something that would shape everything he wrote. The world is not rational, history has no purpose, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling you a comfortable lie. This matters because Schopenhauer spent his career fighting the dominant philosophy of his time, the sweeping historical optimism of Hegel and the German idealists. They said history was the rational unfolding of spirit, that conflicts were necessary stages toward ultimate harmony, that suffering had meaning in the grand scheme. Schopenhauer looked at the same evidence and saw only blind will devouring itself, generation after generation, without purpose or progress. He wrote The World as Will and Representation in his late 20s and 30s, between 1814 and 1818. These are the years after Napoleon's defeat, when Europe is trying to pretend the revolutionary decades never happened. Schopenhauer publishes his masterwork in 1818 and waits for recognition. It doesn't come. Almost nobody reads it. The few reviews are dismissive. The academic establishment ignores him. He tries to lecture at the University of Berlin, deliberately scheduling his classes at the same time as Hegel's. Students choose Hegel. Schopenhauer's classroom sits empty. He will live another 42 years, increasingly bitter, convinced he's right and the age is wrong. And here's the strange part. He'll turn out to be half right. The age was wrong, but not in the way he thought. His pessimism, his rejection of progress, his dark vision of human nature, all of this will become relevant again, but only after he's dead, only after Europe goes through another round of disillusionment. Friedrich Nietzsche was born in 1844, 56 years after Schopenhauer. Different world entirely. Schopenhauer was born in the aftermath of revolution. Nietzsche was born into the age of nation-building, industrialization, scientific materialism. By the time Nietzsche is thinking about philosophy, Darwin has published, Marx is writing, the scientific worldview is triumphant. More specifically, Nietzsche grows up during the unification of Germany. Bismarck is forging a nation through blood and iron. The German states are consolidating into an empire. There's a new confidence in the air, a sense that Germany is rising, that culture and power can be combined, that greatness is possible. Nietzsche serves briefly as a medical orderly in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. He sees carnage, contracts dysentery and diphtheria, and returns home permanently damaged in health. But Germany wins. The German Empire is proclaimed in 1871 in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles. This is the historical moment that shapes Nietzsche's concerns. What happens when a culture achieves power but loses its soul? What happens when military victory and economic success coincide with cultural mediocrity? Schopenhauer's Europe was tired and wanted peace. Nietzsche's Europe was energetic and wanted greatness. Schopenhauer saw through revolutionary optimism. Nietzsche saw through nationalist triumphalism, different disillusions, different angers, and this shows up in how they write. Schopenhauer writes with the confidence of someone who has found the truth and just needs to explain it clearly. His prose is elegant, systematic, sometimes witty in its darkness. He builds arguments like architecture carefully, showing you how each piece supports the whole. He's trying to convince you of a philosophical system. Nietzsche writes like someone fighting against time, against his own declining health, against the possibility that he won't be understood. His books get stranger and more fragmented as he goes on. Aphorisms, exhortations, poetic passages, personal attacks, prophecies. He's not trying to convince you of a system. He's trying to transform you, to shake you awake, to make you different. Schopenhauer wanted to be understood by his own age and was ignored. Nietzsche suspected he wouldn't be understood by his own age and wrote for the future. Schopenhauer lived to 72, respected in old age, finally receiving some recognition. Nietzsche collapsed mentally at 44, spent his last 11 years in darkness, and never knew how famous he would become. The Europe of 1818, when Schopenhauer published his masterwork, still believed philosophy mattered, that systematic thought could reveal truth. The Europe of the 1880s, when Nietzsche published his mature works, was already fragmenting into specializations, already losing faith in grand systems, already moving toward the 20th century's chaos. Schopenhauer stood at the end of classical German philosophy, the last systematic thinker in that tradition, even if his system was a system of pessimism. Nietzsche stood at the beginning of something else, something more dangerous and unstable, philosophy as dynamite, as experiment, as personal testimony. They were both outsiders to academic philosophy, but different kinds of outsiders. Schopenhauer desperately wanted academic recognition and resented being denied it. Nietzsche started with academic success, a professorship at 24, and walked away from it, came to see the academic world as part of what was wrong with philosophy. Two men, two Europes, two ways of being disappointed with modernity. Schopenhauer looked at the aftermath of revolution and concluded, human nature doesn't change, history is meaningless repetition, the will just keeps churning. Nietzsche looked at the triumph of German nationalism and concluded, we've won everything and lost what matters. We need something beyond mere power, beyond mere survival. But here's what connects them across the decades. Both refused the optimism of their ages. Both said no when everyone else was saying yes. Schopenhauer said no to Hegelian progress. Nietzsche said no to nationalist glory and scientific complacency. They were different kinds of no, pointing toward different alternatives. But the refusal itself, the willingness to stand against the spirit of the age, that was the inheritance that passed from the older philosopher to the younger. At the center of everything Schopenhauer wrote sits one word: will. Not will as in willpower or decision-making, not will as in wanting chocolate instead of vanilla. Capital W, will, the thing in itself, the fundamental reality behind all appearances. And this will has one characteristic that defines everything else. It's blind. Think of it this way. You're hungry. Why? You didn't decide to be hungry. Hunger happens to you. You eat. Why? Because the body demands it. You reproduce. Why? Because sexual desire compels you. Behind every human action, every animal instinct, every plant reaching toward light, Schopenhauer sees this same force, blind, aimless, endless wanting. The will doesn't want anything in particular, it just wants. It's want itself, perpetual striving without purpose or satisfaction. You achieve a goal, and immediately the will creates a new goal. You satisfy a desire, and the satisfaction lasts maybe a few minutes before new desires emerge. The will is a cosmic hunger that can never be filled because filling it is not the point. Striving is the point. Or rather, there is no point, just endless striving. This is why life is suffering, according to Schopenhauer. Not because of bad luck or poor planning, but because of what life fundamentally is. Life is will, and will is insatiable desire, and insatiable desire is suffering. The logic is airtight and horrifying. As long as you're alive, you're wanting. As long as you're wanting, you're suffering. The only escape is to stop wanting, to quiet the will, which means in some sense to stop living. Now watch what Nietzsche does with this. He accepts the basic framework. Yes, there's something fundamental driving existence. Yes, it's not rational. Yes, it's not working towards some higher purpose. But then he changes one word and everything inverts. Not will to live, will to power. This sounds like a small change. It's not. The will to live just wants to continue, to survive, to persist. It's defensive, reactive, driven by fear of death and pain. The will to power wants to grow, to expand, to overcome resistance, to create. It's offensive, active, driven by the desire for more life, not just continued life. For Schopenhauer, the fundamental drive is to avoid death. For Nietzsche, the fundamental drive is to enhance life. Completely different visions of what's moving everything. And Nietzsche has evidence. Look at actual living things. Do they just try to survive? No. They compete, they grow, they take risks. They push beyond what's necessary for mere survival. A tree doesn't just survive, it fights for light, spreads its roots, tries to dominate its space. An animal doesn't just eat enough to live, it tries to eat more, to secure better territory, to win mates, to establish dominance. Even bacteria compete for resources beyond what they need. Life doesn't want to persist, life wants to expand. This is the fundamental reorientation, and it changes everything about how you interpret existence. Under Schopenhauer's framework, ambition is the will tricking you into suffering. You want success, you strive, you suffer in the striving, you achieve it and feel briefly satisfied, then the will creates new ambitions and you suffer again. The whole thing is pointless. The wise response is to see through it, to stop playing the game. Under Nietzsche's framework, ambition is life expressing itself authentically. Of course, you want to grow, to overcome, to achieve. That's what life is. The suffering involved isn't a bug, it's a feature. Resistance is what makes achievement meaningful. Struggle is what makes you stronger. The wise response is to embrace it, to want it, to affirm the whole process, including the pain. Schopenhauer says, the will to live creates suffering, therefore deny the will. Nietzsche says, the will to power creates struggle, therefore affirm the struggle. Same starting observation, opposite conclusions. But there's something deeper happening here. Schopenhauer thinks the will is one thing, unified, the same force in everything. You, me, the dog, the tree. We're all just temporary expressions of the one cosmic will. We're not really individuals, we're waves on the same ocean. And this is supposed to generate compassion because hurting someone else is really hurting yourself, hurting the will that's in both of you. Nietzsche rejects this completely. There's no unified will. There are endless competing wills to power, each one trying to grow at the expense of others. You're not a wave on an ocean. You're a battleground where different drives compete for dominance. What you call yourself is just the temporary result of which drives are winning right now. This makes conflict fundamental in a new way. For Schopenhauer, conflict is the will fighting against itself stupidly. For Nietzsche, conflict is what life is. Different centers of power competing, and through that competition creating everything interesting. Art, culture, philosophy, all of it emerges from conflict, from the tension between opposing forces. And this is why Nietzsche thinks Schopenhauer missed something crucial. Schopenhauer looked at suffering and said we need escape. Nietzsche looked at suffering and asked, what if some suffering makes you stronger? What if the struggle to overcome resistance is what creates greatness? What if a life without suffering would be a life without growth, without achievement, without meaning? There's a thought experiment Nietzsche uses. Imagine two lives. One life with constant comfort, no challenges, no pain, no struggle. Another life with intense challenges, real dangers, profound suffering, but also real achievements, genuine growth, moments of triumph. Which life is better? Schopenhauer says the first one, obviously less suffering, is better. Nietzsche says the second one without question, because a comfortable life is a diminished life. The will to live wants safety. The will to power wants intensity. The will to live fears death. The will to power fears boredom. The will to live sees every risk as a threat. The will to power sees every risk as an opportunity. So when you're lying in bed at night and you feel that restless dissatisfaction, that sense that you should be doing something more, becoming something different, pushing towards some undefined goal, what is that? Schopenhauer says it's the will to live torturing you with pointless desires that will only create more suffering. Nietzsche says it's the will to power calling you to grow, and you should listen. When you feel ambitious, when you want to create something, when you want to overcome a challenge, Schopenhauer says you're being manipulated by a blind cosmic force that doesn't care about you. Nietzsche says you're expressing your deepest nature and the world needs more of this, not less. When you succeed at something difficult and feel that surge of satisfaction, Schopenhauer says, enjoy it because it won't last. It's temporary relief from suffering. Nietzsche says, enjoy it because it's real. It's what life is for, and now find a bigger challenge. This isn't just a philosophical disagreement about metaphysics. This is two completely different relationships to your own existence. Schopenhauer offers diagnosis and cure. Life hurts because the will drives you to want, and wanting is suffering. The cure is to want less, to quiet the will through art, contemplation, eventually ascetic denial. Nietzsche offers diagnosis and celebration. Life hurts because growth requires struggle. The response is to want more life, more struggle, more growth, to become who you are through constant self-overcoming. The strange thing is how similar the diagnosis is. Both philosophers agree that life involves suffering. Both agree that simple happiness is not the goal. Both agree that most people live in illusions, chasing satisfactions that won't satisfy. Both see through the comfortable lies of their age. But from this shared starting point, they go in exactly opposite directions. One says the fundamental drive is to continue existing, and this is the source of all suffering, so deny it. The other says the fundamental drive is to expand power, and this is the source of all achievement, so affirm it. And you can't split the difference. There's no compromise position here. Either life's fundamental character is something to escape or something to embrace. Either suffering is pure negative or necessary cost of growth. Either the wise person quiets their desires or intensifies them in service of creation. The will to live versus the will to power. Survival versus growth. Resignation versus affirmation. Everything that follows in both philosophies flows from this fork in the road. Both philosophers start with the same observation. Life hurts. Not just sometimes, not just for some people, but fundamentally, universally, inevitably. This is the ground they share. But watch what each builds on this ground. Schopenhauer has a theory about why suffering is built into existence. Remember his will, that blind cosmic force driving everything. The will expresses itself through desire. You desire food because the will manifests as hunger. You desire sex because the will manifests as sexual drive. You desire status, security, success, all manifestations of the underlying will pushing through you. Now here's the mechanism that creates suffering. Desire is by definition a state of lack. You want something means you don't have it. The wanting itself is uncomfortable. This is obvious with physical desires like hunger or pain, but Schopenhauer extends it to everything. Ambition is uncomfortable because you haven't achieved yet. Longing is uncomfortable because the object is absent. Even boredom is a kind of suffering, the will churning without specific direction. So the first source of suffering is unfulfilled desire. But here's the trap. Fulfilling desire doesn't solve the problem. You eat when hungry, and the satisfaction lasts what? 20 minutes? Then you're hungry again. You achieve a goal you've worked toward for years, and the triumph fades in days. You win the love of someone you've longed for, and soon the relationship becomes familiar, ordinary, the magic gone. Schopenhauer calls this the pendulum of existence. You swing between pain of unfulfilled desire and boredom of fulfilled desire. Want and lack, or satisfaction and emptiness. There's no third option as long as you're willing, and you can't stop willing as long as you're alive. But it gets worse. The will isn't just in you, it's in everyone and everything. And the will in you wants things that conflict with what the will in others wants. Competition for resources, for mates, for status, for space. Your gain is often someone else's loss. The will is at war with itself, using individuals as weapons in a fight with no winner. Look at nature, Schopenhauer says. Really look at it. Not the pretty pastoral version, the real thing. Every creature lives by devouring other creatures. The food chain is just organized suffering, each level feeding on the level below. The wasp that lays eggs in a living caterpillar so its young can eat their way out from inside. The cat playing with a mouse before killing it. The sheer quantity of pain required to sustain even one predator through one day. And humans are no different, just more complicated. We dress up our conflicts in language about justice and rights and meaning, but underneath it's the same. The will using us to fight against itself. Wars, oppression, exploitation, betrayal, all of it, the will in conflict. So Schopenhauer's position is that suffering isn't accidental. It's not bad luck or poor planning or evil people. It's structural, built into what existence is. As long as there's life, there's will. As long as there's will, there's desire. As long as there's desire, there's suffering. The logic is airtight. The only question is what you do about it. Nietzsche looks at the same suffering and asks a different question. What if suffering has different types? What if not all suffering is the same? There's suffering that diminishes and suffering that enhances. Suffering that breaks you down and suffering that builds you up. The suffering of disease is one thing. The suffering of pushing yourself to achieve something difficult is another thing entirely. One destroys, the other creates. Nietzsche spent much of his adult life in severe physical pain, terrible headaches, eye problems, digestive issues that left him unable to eat most foods. He knew suffering intimately, and he noticed something. The suffering of his body was different from the suffering of pushing his mind to new insights. One he resented, the other he valued. This leads him to a distinction Schopenhauer never makes. Some suffering is passive, happens to you, the result of weakness or decline. Other suffering is active, chosen, the price of growth. The suffering of slavery versus the suffering of discipline. The suffering of defeat versus the suffering of training for victory. And here's the radical part. Nietzsche argues that meaningful life requires the second type of suffering, not despite the pain, but because of it. Challenge, resistance, struggle, these aren't obstacles to a good life. They're the ingredients. Think about anything you're proud of achieving. Did it come easily, or did it require effort, sacrifice, overcoming difficulties? Now think about times you achieved something easily. How long did that satisfaction last? Nietzsche's claim is that we value things in proportion to how much we struggled to achieve them. Easy victories feel empty. Hard-won victories feel meaningful. This is why he rejects Schopenhauer's solution. Yes, you could quiet the will, reduce your desires, minimize your suffering, but you'd also minimize your life. You'd purchase peace at the cost of significance. Like taking a drug that makes you not care about anything. Sure, you won't suffer, but you also won't achieve, create, grow, become. Nietzsche keeps returning to the ancient Greeks, particularly the tragic poets. They knew life was suffering. They had no illusions about this. But they didn't conclude that life should be rejected. They created tragedies that looked straight at the horror and said, even so, life is beautiful. Even so, existence is justified. How did they do this? Not by denying suffering, but by transforming it. The Greeks took their deepest pains and turned them into art. They took their conflicts and turned them into competitions. They took their struggles and turned them into stories of heroes. They didn't avoid suffering, they gave it meaning through form. This is the difference between Christian and Greek attitudes towards suffering, according to Nietzsche. Christianity says suffering is punishment for sin or a test of faith or something to be endured for heavenly reward. It's negative, something to escape. Greek tragedy says suffering is the human condition, and the proper response is to face it with courage and transform it into beauty. And Schopenhauer, despite rejecting Christianity, is still thinking like a Christian. He still treats suffering as pure negative, something to minimize. He's just more honest about the impossibility of eliminating it completely. Nietzsche wants to go beyond both Christian resignation and Schopenhauerian resignation. He wants an affirmation that includes suffering as a necessary component. Not suffering for suffering's sake, that would be masochism. But suffering as the resistance that makes achievement possible, the friction that creates heat, the challenge that creates growth. There's a thought Nietzsche keeps circling back to in his notebooks. What if the highest humans are the ones who suffer most? Not because they're unlucky, but because they're attempting the most difficult things, carrying the heaviest weights, climbing the steepest paths. While others choose comfortable mediocrity, the exceptional ones choose difficult greatness, and greatness requires suffering. Schopenhauer would say this is the will tricking you into unnecessary pain. Nietzsche says this is life expressing itself at its highest intensity. And there's something subtle happening here about agency. In Schopenhauer's framework, you're passive. The will drives you to desire. Desire creates suffering. Suffering happens to you. You're a victim of cosmic forces. The best you can do is understand the trap and try to escape it. In Nietzsche's framework, you're active, or you can be. You choose which suffering to embrace. You decide which challenges to take on. The suffering that comes from your chosen path is yours, meaningful, different from the suffering that's merely inflicted on you. You're not just a victim of forces, you're someone who can give your suffering direction and purpose. This connects to what each philosopher thinks about pain and pleasure. Schopenhauer says pleasure is just the absence of pain, a negative. You're hungry, that's pain. You eat, the hunger stops. You call that pleasure, but it's really just pain relief. Real positive pleasure doesn't exist, only relief from discomfort. Nietzsche says this is psychologically false. The pleasure of creating something is not just relief from the pain of not having created it. The joy of overcoming a challenge is not just the absence of the pain of facing the challenge. These are positive experiences, and they require the challenge, the resistance, the difficulty. Without the hard part, there's no real satisfaction. Put it this way, you could live a life where you never feel hungry because you're constantly eating. No pain of hunger, so by Schopenhauer's logic, maximum pleasure. But you know intuitively this wouldn't be pleasurable. The pleasure of eating requires the hunger that precedes it. The satisfaction requires the lack. You need the negative to make the positive meaningful. Nietzsche generalizes this. You need challenge to make achievement meaningful. You need struggle to make victory satisfying. You need the possibility of failure to make success valuable. A game you can't lose is not worth playing. A life without real risks is not worth living. So when Schopenhauer looks at suffering and sees evidence that life is a mistake, Nietzsche looks at the same suffering and sees evidence that life is difficult, which is exactly what makes it potentially great. The difficulty is not a flaw to be overcome. The difficulty is the point. This creates completely different attitudes toward your own pain. If you accept Schopenhauer, every time you suffer, you're confirming his philosophy. The world is showing you again that existence is suffering and you should want less of it. If you accept Nietzsche, suffering becomes a question. Is this the passive suffering of decline or the active suffering of growth? Is this pain diminishing me or forging me? And Nietzsche admits, most suffering is the first kind. Disease, loss, humiliation, failure, most of it is just bad, doesn't make you better, just hurts. He's not romanticizing all pain, but he's saying that the suffering involved in attempting difficult things, in pushing your limits, in creating something new, that's different. That's the cost of admission to a meaningful life. Schopenhauer's response would be, this is the will rationalizing itself, making you think your suffering has meaning, so you'll keep willing, keep striving, keep suffering. It's the same trap with better decoration. Nietzsche's response would be, denying life's value because it involves suffering is like denying art's value because it requires effort. The effort is part of what makes it valuable. Significance requires sacrifice. You can have a painless life or a meaningful life, but probably not both. The suffering question comes down to this. Is suffering evidence that life is a mistake, or is suffering the price of everything worthwhile? Your answer determines whether wisdom means withdrawal or engagement, whether the proper response to existence is no or yes. Schopenhauer loved music more than any other art form, which is interesting because music is the art form most distant from language, most resistant to conceptual analysis. He claimed music bypassed the world of representation entirely and gave us direct access to the will itself. When you hear a symphony, you're not perceiving an image of something else. You're directly experiencing the fundamental force of existence. This sounds like a compliment to music, and it is. But notice what function art serves in his philosophy. Art offers temporary escape from the will. You're ordinarily trapped in willing, in desire, in the cycle of suffering. But when you experience great art, something changes. You stop willing. You become pure perception, consciousness without desire, contemplation without goal. Think about when you're truly absorbed in a painting or a piece of music. You forget yourself. You forget your wants. Time seems to stop. You're not trying to get anything from the experience, you're just in it. This is what Schopenhauer values, the momentary quieting of the will. And he has a hierarchy of arts based on how effectively they achieve this. Architecture is lowest because it's most tied to material function. Literature is higher because it deals with ideas. Music is highest because it transcends representation completely and gives us the will without the suffering, like hearing the sound without experiencing the source. But here's the catch, it's only temporary. The concert ends, you walk out of the museum, you close the book, and the will reasserts itself. You're hungry again, ambitious again, wanting again. Art is a vacation from suffering, not a permanent solution. The permanent solution for Schopenhauer is asceticism, the saint who renounces desire altogether, who has seen through the illusion that satisfying the will could ever bring lasting peace. Art prepares you for this by showing you what consciousness without willing feels like, but the final step is to make that state permanent through renunciation. Now watch how Nietzsche interprets the same aesthetic experiences toward completely different ends. For Nietzsche, art isn't escape from life, it's the ultimate affirmation of life. Art takes the raw material of existence, including its suffering and chaos, and transforms it into something beautiful. The artist doesn't flee from reality, the artist transfigures reality. Take Greek tragedy again because Nietzsche keeps returning to it. The tragedians didn't look away from suffering, they put it on stage, showed it in full intensity. Heroes destroyed by fate, families torn apart, cities falling. But they did this with such beauty, such powerful form, that the audience didn't leave crushed. They left elevated. How? Because the art demonstrated that even the worst suffering can be transformed into beauty through form, through style, through the creative act. The content is terrible, but the form is triumphant. This is affirmation, not denying the horror, but proving that human creativity can meet it, match it, make something valuable from it. Nietzsche distinguishes between two kinds of art based on this. There's art that says yes to life and art that says no. Art that enhances your engagement with reality versus art that helps you escape reality. Art that makes you stronger versus art that soothes you into passivity. And by this standard, Schopenhauer's entire aesthetic theory is decadent. It values art precisely for its ability to quiet the will, to reduce engagement with life. Nietzsche thinks this gets the function of art exactly backward. Real art, vital art, doesn't help you forget yourself. It helps you become more yourself. It doesn't quiet your desires, it refines them, focuses them, gives them form and direction. It doesn't offer escape from struggle, it trains you for struggle by showing you how to transform difficulty into beauty. Here's where this gets specific. Both philosophers think about artists differently. Schopenhauer sees the genius artist as someone who can perceive the eternal forms beyond individual things, who has unusual access to the will itself, who can share this vision through art. The artist is almost like a priest, mediating between ordinary people and higher reality. Nietzsche sees the artist as someone who imposes form on chaos, who creates values rather than discovering them, who makes beauty rather than revealing it. The artist is more like a warrior, conquering formless reality by giving it shape. For Schopenhauer, the greatest art reveals truth. For Nietzsche, the greatest art creates truth. For Schopenhauer, art shows us what's really there beneath appearances. For Nietzsche, art makes real what wasn't there before. This connects to their different views on illusion. Schopenhauer thinks most of life is illusion, the veil of Maya hiding the terrible truth. Art briefly penetrates this veil. Nietzsche thinks the so-called truth is often uglier than necessary, and art creates beautiful illusions that make life bearable, even wonderful. Art doesn't destroy illusions, it creates better ones. There's a line in The Birth of Tragedy where Nietzsche says, "We have art so that we do not perish from truth." He means this literally. Pure truth, unadorned reality, would be unbearable. We need the beautiful lie, the artistic transformation, not as escape, but as equipment for living. Schopenhauer would say this is exactly wrong. We have truth so that we see through art's temporary comforts to the permanent solution of renunciation. Art is training wheels for asceticism. Look at how they each respond to music specifically, since both valued it highly. Schopenhauer listens to music and hears the will itself, the cosmic force in its pure form. And this is valuable because it shows you what's really moving everything, prepares you to renounce it. Nietzsche listens to music and hears life saying yes to itself, affirmation in sound, and this is valuable because it teaches you how to affirm. Wagner becomes crucial here because both philosophers loved Wagner's music, but heard completely different things. Schopenhauer died before Wagner's mature works, but Wagner read Schopenhauer and built his later operas on Schopenhauerian themes. Tristan und Isolde especially, with its themes of renunciation and death as release. Young Nietzsche adored Wagner, visited him, wrote about him, called his music the rebirth of tragedy. But as Nietzsche developed his own philosophy, he started hearing something troubling in Wagner. The music was beautiful, yes, but it was seductive in a dangerous way. It made you want to dissolve into feeling, to lose yourself, to escape into aesthetic reverie. It was Schopenhauerian. Nietzsche's break with Wagner is partly personal, but it's also philosophical. Wagner's music had become the art of escape, gorgeous and numbing, exactly what Schopenhauer prescribed. Nietzsche wanted art that stimulated, provoked, strengthened. He started praising Bizet's Carmen instead, calling it healthier, more Mediterranean, more life-affirming. Whether Nietzsche was right about Bizet isn't the point. The point is the criteria. He's judging art by whether it increases or decreases your capacity for life. Does it make you more able to face difficulty, or does it make you want to retreat from difficulty? Does it sharpen your senses or dull them? Does it prepare you for action or for contemplation? And this reveals a deeper disagreement about what consciousness is for. Schopenhauer thinks the highest use of consciousness is pure perception, will-less contemplation, the aesthetic state where you forget yourself in the object. Nietzsche thinks the highest use of consciousness is creative action, willful transformation, the artistic state where you impose your vision on reality. One says the best moments are when you disappear into contemplation. The other says the best moments are when you appear in creation. One values receptivity, the other productivity. One says consciousness should be a mirror, the other says consciousness should be a hammer. This even affects how they think about beauty itself. Schopenhauer has a fairly classical view. Beauty is harmony, proportion, the form that reveals eternal ideas. Nietzsche thinks beauty is whatever stimulates life, which might include harmony but also dissonance, might include proportion but also excess, might include classical forms but also barbarian energy. Schopenhauer would look at a perfectly proportioned Greek temple and see beauty as revelation of form. Nietzsche would look at the same temple and see beauty as the will of a people expressed in stone, the triumph of Apollo over Dionysus, the imposition of form on chaos. Same object, completely different interpretation. And when it comes to the artist's life, they diverge completely. Schopenhauer thinks great artists are tortured precisely because they see more clearly into the nature of the will, they understand the suffering at existence's core. Their art comes from this insight, and their personal suffering proves their depth. Nietzsche thinks this romanticizes suffering in exactly the wrong way. Yes, great artists often suffer, but not because they see cosmic truth. They suffer because they're attempting difficult things, because creation is hard, because transforming chaos into form requires enormous energy. The suffering is byproduct of the work, not source of the wisdom. One sees the suffering artist as victim of cosmic knowledge. The other sees the suffering artist as engaged in cosmic creation. One pities the artist. The other envies the artist. One says, "Look what knowledge costs." The other says, "Look what creation achieves." So when you engage with art, from Schopenhauer's perspective, you should let it quiet your willing, lose yourself in contemplation, use it as rehearsal for renouncing desire altogether. From Nietzsche's perspective, you should let it intensify your willing, find yourself in creation, use it as training for affirming desire as the source of all achievement. The art of escape versus the art of affirmation. One leads away from life toward peace, the other leads deeper into life toward intensity. Same aesthetic experiences, opposite philosophical purposes. Schopenhauer builds his entire ethics on one emotion: compassion. This is unusual, maybe unique in Western philosophy. Most ethical systems start with reason, duty, virtue, happiness, or divine command. Schopenhauer starts with feeling, specifically the feeling of shared suffering. Here's how it works. Normally, you experience yourself as separate from others. You have your pain, I have mine. You have your interests, I have mine. This is the world of representation, the world of individuation, the illusory world of separateness. But beneath this illusion is the truth. The same will that suffers in you suffers in me. We're not actually separate beings. We're manifestations of one underlying reality. When you feel genuine compassion, Schopenhauer says, you're experiencing a breakthrough of this truth. You see through the illusion of separateness. You recognize that my suffering is not really different from your suffering. The boundary between us dissolves, and because you experience my pain as if it were yours, you're motivated to relieve it, not from duty or calculation, but from immediate feeling. This is why Schopenhauer thinks compassion is the only genuine moral motivation. Everything else is either selfish or follows from external rules. But compassion arises spontaneously when you perceive the truth. We're all suffering together because we're all one will in conflict with itself. And he extends this to all living creatures. The same will that suffers in humans suffers in animals. A dog's pain is metaphysically identical to a human's pain, just the same cosmic will experiencing itself through a different form. This makes Schopenhauer one of the first major Western philosophers to argue seriously for animal welfare based on philosophical grounds rather than sentiment. He tells a story about seeing two young men torturing a dog for amusement. He confronts them and they laugh. He walks away thinking, they don't understand that the pain they're causing is ultimately their own pain, that the will they're torturing is the same will that exists in them. They see the dog as other, as separate, and this illusion allows cruelty. So compassion isn't just a nice feeling, it's metaphysical insight made emotional, it's truth breaking through illusion. And from compassion flows both justice, not harming others because you recognize their suffering as your own, and loving kindness, actively relieving suffering where you can. This makes Schopenhauer's ethics fairly simple in structure. One rule: minimize suffering, your own and others, though really these aren't different. Don't cause unnecessary pain. Relieve pain where possible. The good life is the compassionate life, and the highest human is the saint who has fully transcended the illusion of separateness and treats all suffering as worthy of concern. Now watch Nietzsche systematically demolish this entire structure. He starts with a psychological question: where does compassion actually come from? Schopenhauer says it comes from metaphysical insight, from seeing through individuation to the unity of the will. Nietzsche says it comes from something much more mundane: weakness. Think about when you feel compassion. Usually when someone is suffering, vulnerable, in a weaker position than you. You see a homeless person, a sick child, an injured animal, you feel compassion. But do you feel compassion for the strong, the healthy, the triumphant? No. Compassion is specifically a response to weakness and suffering. Now Nietzsche asks, what does it say about you that you're drawn to weakness? He thinks it reveals that you're identifying with weakness. You see suffering and think, that could be me. I'm also vulnerable. I'm also potentially weak. Compassion is the emotion of people who see themselves in victims. And he connects this to Christianity, which makes compassion central. Christianity says, blessed are the poor, the meek, the suffering. Christianity elevates weakness into virtue. Why? Nietzsche's controversial answer: because Christianity is the morality of the weak. People who lack power convince themselves that powerlessness is holy. People who suffer convince themselves that suffering is noble. It's a brilliant psychological move. It transforms resentment into righteousness. Schopenhauer, despite rejecting Christianity's metaphysics, completely accepts Christianity's moral framework. He even says Buddhism and Christianity understood ethics correctly, even if their cosmologies were wrong. Both traditions make compassion central. Both elevate suffering. Both see existence as something to escape rather than enhance. Nietzsche thinks this is exactly the problem. An ethics based on compassion is an ethics that privileges the weak, the suffering, the declining. It says the good person is the one who reduces suffering, who helps the vulnerable, who identifies with the victim. But what about the healthy, the strong, the ascending? An ethics of compassion has nothing to say to them except feel bad about your strength, help those weaker than you, make yourself useful to the suffering. This is what Nietzsche means when he calls compassion a weakness. Not that feeling compassion makes you physically weak, but that an ethics of compassion makes strength suspect and weakness sacred. It inverts natural values. In nature, the strong thrive and the weak perish. Compassion-based ethics says this is wrong, the strong should sacrifice themselves for the weak. And Nietzsche asks, why? Not why should you follow this ethics, but why did this ethics arise? His answer, slave morality. The weak, unable to overcome the strong directly, create a moral system that makes their weakness into virtue and the strong strength into vice. They call their inability to retaliate forgiveness, their powerlessness humility, their weakness meekness, and their suffering moral superiority. Schopenhauer would say this is completely missing the point. Compassion isn't about weak versus strong. It's about recognizing the shared suffering of all beings. The strong suffer too, just in different ways. And compassion toward the weak isn't condescension. It's recognition of identity beneath the illusion of difference. Nietzsche's response would be, even if everyone suffers, why should reducing suffering be the goal? This assumes suffering is purely negative, which brings us back to the suffering question. If suffering is necessary for growth, then an ethics of compassion that seeks to reduce all suffering is actually an ethics that prevents growth. Put it concretely, a child struggles with a difficult problem. Compassion says, help them reduce their suffering. But if you solve the problem for them, you rob them of the growth that comes from solving it themselves. The compassionate act prevents the very achievement that would make the struggle meaningful. Nietzsche generalizes this. Compassion towards someone struggling to become stronger is actually harmful to them. It interferes with their self-overcoming. The truly helpful response is not to ease their struggle, but to demand more from them, to hold them to higher standards, to refuse to lower expectations. This sounds harsh, and Nietzsche admits it is harsh. But he thinks genuine care sometimes requires harshness. The parent who disciplines is caring more truly than the parent who indulges. The teacher who demands excellence is serving the student better than the teacher who accepts mediocrity. Compassion often looks like enabling weakness, and there's a social dimension. Schopenhauer's ethics implies you should help everyone equally because all suffering is equal. The suffering of the criminal is metaphysically identical to the suffering of the victim. Nietzsche thinks this is insane. Some people deserve their suffering because they're suffering the consequences of their own choices. Some people's suffering is the price they pay for attempting difficult things and should be respected, not pitied. More radically, Nietzsche thinks some suffering is good for the species because it eliminates what's weak and preserves what's strong. Nature works through struggle, competition, selection. Compassion that protects everyone equally interferes with this process, preserves weakness, prevents the strong from emerging. This is where Nietzsche's philosophy becomes genuinely troubling to modern ears. He seems to be saying society shouldn't help the weak, should let them perish, should focus resources on cultivating the strong. This sounds like social Darwinism at best, eugenics at worst, but Nietzsche's actual position is more complicated. He's not arguing for political policy. He's arguing about values, about what we consider admirable. He thinks a culture that makes compassion the highest value will inevitably celebrate weakness, resent excellence, and pull everyone toward mediocrity. He wants a culture that celebrates strength, achievement, and greatness, even though this is difficult and most people will not achieve it. Schopenhauer would say this is precisely the will speaking through Nietzsche, making him rationalize the struggle for power as meaningful when it's actually just more pointless suffering. The will to power is just will to live with different marketing, and the ethics of strength that Nietzsche proposes will create more suffering, not less, more conflict, more cruelty, more pain. Nietzsche would say Schopenhauer's compassion ethics is life-denying. It starts from the assumption that life is suffering and concludes we should minimize life. Less will, less desire, less striving, ultimately less existence. This is nihilism dressed up as morality, and it's psychologically dishonest because Schopenhauer himself never stopped willing, never stopped striving for recognition, never practiced the asceticism he prescribed. Schopenhauer would say Nietzsche's strength ethics is cruelty rationalized. It starts from the assumption that some lives matter more than others, and concludes we should sacrifice the many for the few. This is barbarism dressed up as philosophy, and it's hypocritical because Nietzsche himself was physically weak, sickly, dependent on others' care his entire life, and both accusations have bite. Schopenhauer did continue willing until his death, enjoyed fine dining, collected art, wanted fame. Nietzsche did depend on compassion from friends and family, needed care from others, benefited from the very ethics he attacked. But maybe that's not hypocrisy so much as the human condition's complexity. Schopenhauer was honest that complete renunciation is rare, that most of us can only glimpse the will-less state temporarily. Nietzsche was honest that physical weakness doesn't negate philosophical insight, that greatness is about the soul, not the body. The compassion controversy comes down to this. Is the highest human the one who feels others' pain most deeply and works to relieve it, or the one who pursues excellence even when this requires hardness towards self and others? Is morality about reducing suffering or about enabling greatness? Your answer determines whether you see kindness or achievement as the primary virtue. What? In 1818, when Schopenhauer published The World as Will and Representation, most Europeans knew almost nothing about Buddhism. There were fragmentary accounts from travelers, some missionary reports, but no serious philosophical engagement. Schopenhauer was working from limited sources, translations of translations, incomplete accounts, and yet he immediately recognized something. He saw in Buddhism confirmation of his own philosophy. Here was an ancient tradition developed independently of Western thought that agreed with his fundamental insights. Life is suffering. Suffering comes from desire. Desire comes from ignorance. Enlightenment requires overcoming desire. The Four Noble Truths mapped almost perfectly onto his own system. More than that, Buddhism offered something Western philosophy lacked, a practical path. Schopenhauer could diagnose the problem, explain why existence is suffering, show how the will creates endless desire. But what were you supposed to do about it? Be an ascetic somehow, renounce the will. How exactly? He didn't have detailed methods. Buddhism did. Meditation, ethical conduct, wisdom training, a complete system for actually achieving the liberation his philosophy pointed toward. So Schopenhauer became Buddhism's great champion in Western philosophy. He called himself a Buddhist, though he never practiced seriously. He kept a statue of the Buddha on his desk. He scattered Buddhist references throughout his later work. He argued that the profound wisdom of the East confirmed the errors of Western optimism. But here's what's interesting. Schopenhauer was almost certainly misunderstanding Buddhism in important ways. He read it through his own pessimistic framework. He emphasized the suffering, the renunciation, the world denial. He downplayed or didn't understand the aspects of Buddhism that didn't fit his system. For instance, Buddhism speaks of enlightenment as blissful, as the highest happiness, even calls the Buddha's state after awakening supreme bliss. Schopenhauer's framework can't really account for this. If you've quieted the will completely, you should feel nothing, or at best a kind of neutral peace. Bliss implies positive affect, which implies some form of willing. Or consider that Buddhist practice involves tremendous discipline, effort, striving. You sit in meditation for hours despite pain and boredom. You study complex philosophy. You work to transform your mind. This is willing, just directed at ending willing. The paradox doesn't quite resolve in Schopenhauer's terms, but none of this mattered to his larger point. Whether or not he understood Buddhism correctly, he was using it as evidence that his philosophy wasn't just one German pessimist's weird ideas. An entire civilization, maybe the oldest continuous philosophical tradition on Earth, had reached similar conclusions. Existence is suffering. Attachment creates suffering. Liberation requires non-attachment. The East understood what the West refused to face. Nietzsche encountered Buddhism through Schopenhauer, which means he encountered it already filtered through pessimistic interpretation. And his initial response was exactly what you'd expect. He hated it. He calls Buddhism the most dangerous of all possible modes of thought. He says it's nihilism incarnate, the complete denial of life, everything wrong with Schopenhauer's philosophy taken to its logical conclusion. Where Schopenhauer at least acknowledged the will even while trying to escape it, Buddhism denies even the reality of a unified self to do the willing. Everything is suffering, everything is impermanent, nothing has essential nature. This is philosophical suicide, according to Nietzsche. But then something interesting happens in his later work. He starts distinguishing between what he calls active and passive nihilism. Passive nihilism is exhausted life that can't go on and wants to stop. Active nihilism is strong life that has outgrown its previous values and needs to destroy them to create new ones. And he suggests maybe Buddhism, at least in its original form before it degenerated into popular religion, was active nihilism. Maybe the Buddha wasn't a weakling fleeing from life, but a spiritual warrior who had outgrown the Vedic tradition and needed to destroy its values to create something new. Maybe the denial of the self wasn't life denial, but the clearing away of illusion to make something else possible. Nietzsche never fully develops this thought, and he still mostly treats Buddhism as decadent. But the fact that he's even considering it reveals something. He's genuinely grappling with how to interpret a tradition that denies many of the values he holds most dear, yet produced figures of obvious strength and discipline. The question becomes, can you deny the self while affirming life? Can you overcome attachment while still creating? Can you see through illusion while still acting powerfully in the world? Buddhism seems to say yes. Nietzsche's philosophy says these are contradictions. Or maybe the real question is what each tradition means by liberation. For Buddhism, as Schopenhauer understood it, liberation is escape from the cycle of suffering and rebirth. Nirvana is blowing out the flame of desire, stepping off the wheel entirely. The liberated being is free from life. For Nietzsche, liberation is becoming who you truly are, actualizing your potential, creating values rather than accepting them. The liberated being is maximally alive, not free from life, but free in life, free to shape existence according to their own vision. Same word, opposite meanings. Both traditions say attachment causes suffering. Buddhism says overcome attachment by seeing its emptiness. Nietzsche says overcome attachment to old values by creating new ones. One points toward cessation, the other toward transformation. And both philosophers noticed that Buddhism arose in a specific context. It emerged in ancient India during a time of philosophical fermentation, when various teachers were questioning Vedic orthodoxy. The Buddha was responding to particular problems in a particular culture. Schopenhauer sees this and says, yes, and those problems are universal. The suffering the Buddha diagnosed is the suffering of existence itself. His solution applies everywhere, to everyone, always. Nietzsche sees this and says, yes, and that tells us Buddhism is a historical phenomenon, not eternal truth. It solved problems for ancient Indians. Those might not be our problems. We need our own solutions, not imported wisdom. This connects to their different views on Eastern versus Western thought generally. Schopenhauer thinks the East got the fundamentals right, understood the nature of existence better than the West with its Christian optimism and Hegelian progress myths. The East saw clearly that life is suffering and wisdom is withdrawal. Nietzsche thinks this is romanticizing the exotic. Yes, the East produced profound thoughts. So did Greece. So did the Renaissance. Different cultures at different times achieve philosophical heights. But there's no timeless Eastern wisdom superior to Western thought. There are just different responses to different conditions. More specifically, Nietzsche suspects Buddhism appeals to Europeans precisely when European culture is declining. When a culture is vital, it doesn't need Buddhist resignation. It's busy creating, building, conquering, not because it's deluded, but because it's healthy. Buddhism becomes attractive when vitality wanes, when people are tired, when life feels like a burden rather than an opportunity. So Schopenhauer's embrace of Buddhism is itself a symptom of 19th century German exhaustion. The revolutionary energy has collapsed, the philosophical systems have failed, industrialization is creating alienation, people are looking for escape. Buddhism offers sophisticated philosophical justification for wanting out. But Nietzsche also admits grudgingly that Buddhism is honest about what it wants. It doesn't dress up life denial in life-affirming language. It doesn't claim that suffering is secret blessing or that renunciation leads to ultimate fulfillment. It just says, existence is dukkha, unsatisfactory, and here's the exit. Take it or don't. Christianity bothers Nietzsche more because it seems dishonest in comparison. Christianity also preaches renunciation, also values suffering, also promises reward in another existence. But it can't admit this is world denial. It has to claim God loves the world, life is a gift, suffering has redemptive meaning. Buddhism at least owns its pessimism. There's a passage in the Antichrist where Nietzsche says Buddhism is 100 times more realistic than Christianity because it has left behind the concept of God, doesn't need divine command to justify its ethics, treats the spiritual life as a physiological problem with practical solutions. This is praise from Nietzsche, even if he disagrees with Buddhism's goals. And this reveals something about both thinkers' relationship to religion generally. Neither was religious in any conventional sense. Both rejected Christianity's metaphysics completely. But both thought religion addressed real human needs, real psychological realities that philosophy had to take seriously. Schopenhauer saw in Buddhism a religion that agreed with his philosophy, that had transformed metaphysical insight into practical wisdom accessible to millions. He wanted something similar for the West, philosophy that could guide life, not just explain existence. Nietzsche saw in Buddhism a worthy opponent, a coherent life-denying system that at least had the courage of its convictions. Better an honest Buddhist than a lukewarm Christian who claims to affirm life while secretly wanting escape. But ultimately, for Schopenhauer, Buddhism proved you could build a civilization on pessimism, could create art and ethics and meaning while acknowledging suffering as fundamental. For Nietzsche, Buddhism proved that even the most sophisticated renunciation was still renunciation, still saying no to life, still the wrong answer no matter how profound the question. Buddhism through German eyes became a mirror. Schopenhauer looked and saw confirmation. Nietzsche looked and saw warning. Same tradition, opposite lessons, because they were looking for different things. One wanted wisdom that justified withdrawal, the other wanted wisdom that enabled creation. One found a philosophical ally in the East. The other found a magnificent mistake, beautifully articulated, powerfully practiced, and fundamentally wrong. Both Schopenhauer and Nietzsche were unrepentant elitists. Neither had any patience for the idea that all humans are equal in talent, potential, or value. Both believed in exceptional individuals who rise above the common mass. But what they thought these exceptional individuals were exceptional at, and why this mattered, reveals the core of their disagreement. Schopenhauer's genius is someone with unusual perceptive capacity. Most people are trapped in practical concerns, seeing the world through the lens of the will's demands. They look at a tree and think, can I eat from it? Can I use its wood? Does it provide shade? They're always asking what's useful, what serves their interests. The genius sees differently. They can look at the tree without wanting anything from it, can perceive its form without reference to use. They apprehend the eternal idea that the tree manifests, the universal treeness beneath the particular instance. This is a cognitive gift, almost like a mutation. The genius has access to knowledge that others lack, and this knowledge makes them suffer more than ordinary people. They see through the illusions that make life bearable. They understand the futility of the will's striving. They perceive existence's fundamental character more clearly. The genius is simultaneously blessed with insight and cursed with understanding. This creates a paradox. The genius is higher than ordinary people in knowledge, but often lower in practical life. They're distracted, impractical, unable to play the social games that bring conventional success. They might die poor and ignored, like Schopenhauer himself feared he would. But their inner life is richer because they've accessed something beyond the ordinary human condition. Schopenhauer has a hierarchy here. At the bottom, people who are purely willful, driven entirely by animal desires, no capacity for reflection. In the middle, the majority of humans who have some reason but use it mainly to serve the will better, to get what they want more effectively. Higher, the minority capable of genuine aesthetic experience, who can lose themselves in contemplation. At the peak, the vanishingly rare genius who can not only perceive the eternal ideas but create works that communicate this vision to others, and rarer still, the saint who has progressed beyond even genius to complete renunciation. The herd, the mass of humanity, serves a function in Schopenhauer's framework. They're evidence of what the will produces when it has its way. Endless reproduction, endless striving for trivial goals, endless suffering unredeemed by understanding. The genius looks at the herd and sees the will's mechanism in action, which deepens their insight and their misanthropy. But Schopenhauer doesn't think the genius should try to elevate the herd. Most people can't be taught to see as the genius sees. It's not a matter of education or effort, it's a matter of fundamental capacity. You either have the perceptive gift or you don't. The best the genius can do is create works of art that might give ordinary people temporary glimpses of what the genius sees constantly. So the relationship between genius and herd is essentially one-way communication. The genius suffers their isolated understanding, occasionally produces something beautiful, and the herd might or might not appreciate it. There's no mutual transformation, no dialectical process, just a fundamental inequality of vision. Now watch Nietzsche completely reconfigure this. His exceptional human, eventually called the Übermensch, is not primarily defined by perceptive capacity, but by creative power. The question isn't whether you can see eternal forms behind appearances. The question is whether you can create new values, new forms, new ways of being human. This shifts everything. Schopenhauer's genius is passive in an important sense. They receive insight, perceive what's there, contemplate truth. Nietzsche's creator is active. They make what wasn't there, impose their vision on reality, transform the possible. And Nietzsche's exceptional human doesn't suffer from too much knowledge. They suffer from the difficulty of creation itself, the pain of bringing something new into existence, the loneliness of living by values others don't yet understand, the burden of responsibility for their own meaning. This is different suffering than Schopenhauer's epistemological anguish. More importantly, Nietzsche thinks the exceptional human serves a cultural function that Schopenhauer's genius doesn't. The creator doesn't just make beautiful objects for occasional contemplation. They establish new values that eventually transform the culture. They're not communicating eternal truths, they're creating temporal truths, making real what was only potential. Think about how Nietzsche describes the process. The herd lives by inherited values. They accept what's been handed down, follow the rules, think what everyone thinks. This is natural and even necessary for social stability. But it means herd morality is always conservative, backward-looking, based on what worked in the past. The creator sees that these values are human inventions, not eternal truths. And seeing this, they're free to invent new ones. They can look at herd morality and say, this served its purpose, but we need something different now. And through the force of their creation, through the power of their example, they can shift the culture's values. This makes the relationship between creator and herd dynamic rather than static. The creator emerges from the herd, rises above it, creates new values, and these values eventually influence the herd. Today's radical becomes tomorrow's common sense. The exceptional individual doesn't just contemplate apart from the mass, they reshape the mass through their creation. But Nietzsche is also harsher about the herd than Schopenhauer in certain ways. Schopenhauer pities the common people for their limited vision. Nietzsche has contempt for their voluntary limitation. He thinks most people could be more than they are, but choose comfort over growth, security over risk, belonging over individuality. The herd mentality isn't just limited intelligence, it's active cowardice. The herd fears standing out, fears disagreement, fears the responsibility of thinking for themselves. They want authorities to tell them what to think, traditions to follow, groups to belong to. They trade autonomy for acceptance. And herd morality reflects this cowardice. It punishes deviation, rewards conformity, makes mediocrity into virtue. Anyone who rises above the herd level becomes threatening. The herd can't tolerate the exceptional because the exceptional makes the ordinary feel insufficient. So herd morality is designed to protect the herd from having to feel inadequate by preventing anyone from being superior. Nietzsche calls this leveling, the reduction of all differences, the demand that everyone be equal in the sense of equally limited. Democracy, socialism, Christianity's universal brotherhood, he sees all of these as expressions of herd mentality trying to make sure no one rises too high. Schopenhauer would say this misses the point. The masses aren't choosing mediocrity, they're incapable of more. You can't blame them for limits they didn't choose. And the genius doesn't rise above them through effort. The genius is different by nature. It's not a moral achievement, it's a cognitive gift. Nietzsche would say this is too easy, lets everyone off the hook. Yes, capacity varies, but most people achieve far less than they could because they're afraid. They choose the comfortable lie over the difficult truth. They choose to follow rather than think. And this is contemptible precisely because it's chosen. Here's where this gets most interesting. Both philosophers think exceptional individuals are lonely, but for different reasons. Schopenhauer's genius is lonely because others can't understand what they understand. They've seen something others can't see. It's epistemological isolation. Nietzsche's creator is lonely because others won't follow where they lead, won't take the risks they take, won't embrace the values they create. It's existential isolation, the isolation of the person who has values that aren't yet validated by the culture. And both think this loneliness is permanent, but again differently. For Schopenhauer, the genius will always be isolated because the perceptive gift can't be taught or shared. At best, art might communicate something indirectly. For Nietzsche, the creator is lonely now but might not be forever, because if their creation succeeds, if their values take hold, future people might understand. The isolation is historical, not metaphysical. This changes the temporal structure of how they think about greatness. Schopenhauer's genius exists in a kind of eternal present. They contemplate timeless forms. Their works might last or might not, but the value of their insight doesn't depend on historical reception. The genius is complete in themselves. Nietzsche's creator is essentially historical. They're creating values for a future that doesn't yet exist. Their work is incomplete until it finds reception, until it transforms culture. The creator needs the future to validate them, even if they die before that future arrives. Both philosophers wrote as if they were such exceptional individuals, unrecognized by their contemporaries, writing for the future. But Schopenhauer wrote systematic philosophy explaining eternal truths, while Nietzsche wrote experiments in thinking designed to transform readers. One is teaching perception, the other attempting creation. And this affects how they think the exceptional individual should live. Schopenhauer says the genius should withdraw as much as possible from practical life, preserve their perceptive capacity, create when inspiration strikes, engage minimally with the world because the world will only corrupt the purity of vision. Nietzsche says the creator should engage intensely with the world, test themselves against resistance, create through struggle, not withdraw but immerse, because creation happens through transformation of actual materials, actual conditions, actual human possibilities. Schopenhauer's ideal is the contemplative hermit producing occasional works of genius. Nietzsche's ideal is the warrior artist reshaping culture through creative force. One preserves exceptional vision by isolation. The other achieves exceptional creation through engagement. The genius and the herd, the creator and the mass, the exceptional and the ordinary. Both philosophers build hierarchies where the few rise above the many. But in Schopenhauer's hierarchy, the few escape the suffering the many remain trapped in. In Nietzsche's hierarchy, the few suffer more intensely than the many because they're attempting more difficult things. One hierarchy is about liberation from life. The other is about intensification of life. Schopenhauer was, by all accounts, a difficult man in romantic relationships. He never married, he had affairs but no lasting partnerships. He could be cruel in his judgments of women, saying things in his essays that remain shocking even accounting for 19th century attitudes. And yet he thought about sex and reproduction with unusual depth and honesty. His theory goes like this. Sexual desire is the will at its most intense and undeniable. You can maybe resist hunger for a while, can distract yourself from ambition. But sexual desire persists with peculiar power, and there's a reason. Sexual desire is how the will perpetuates itself through the generations. You think you desire this particular person, but really the will is using that desire to create more life, more suffering, more willing. Schopenhauer has a whole theory about why we find certain people attractive. It's not subjective or mysterious. The will is trying to balance traits, to produce offspring that correct the deficiencies of both parents. If you're short, you're attracted to tall people. If you're too masculine, you're attracted to very feminine people. The will calculates through instinct what combination would produce the healthiest offspring. This is why love feels fated, why you might desire someone who's completely wrong for you in every practical way. Your conscious rational preferences don't matter. The will has its own agenda, and it's not your happiness. It's making more humans, continuing the cycle of willing and suffering. And falling in love is the will's most elaborate trap. You meet someone, you feel this overwhelming sense that they are the one, that your life depends on being with them. You'll sacrifice everything, rationality, dignity, other relationships, career, all of it to pursue this person. Schopenhauer says this is because the will has an unusually strong interest in the offspring you two specifically would produce. The intensity of love correlates with the genetic significance of the pairing. But here's the dark part. Once reproduction happens, or once it becomes clear it won't happen, the passion fades. The will has used you for its purposes and moves on. What you thought was eternal connection was temporary madness induced by biological imperative. The couple who marry in passionate love often end up bored or hostile because the will's interest in their pairing is finished. Schopenhauer wrote all this in the 1840s, before Darwin, before genetics, before modern evolutionary biology, and he predicted what later science would confirm. Mate selection follows patterns that serve reproductive success, not individual happiness. We are, in his view, puppets of the species' need to continue. This makes him deeply suspicious of romantic love. It's not a path to happiness or fulfillment, it's how the will tricks you into creating more sufferers. The wise person sees through this, doesn't mistake biological urge for profound connection, doesn't subordinate their life to sexual passion. But Schopenhauer also admits the power is real. Even knowing it's the will's trap doesn't make you immune. Sexual desire isn't something you can eliminate through understanding. It's too fundamental. The best you can do is see it clearly and try not to let it destroy you completely. His view of women flows from this framework, and it's not flattering. He thinks women are more closely aligned with the will because their biological role in reproduction is more demanding. They have to be more attuned to the species' needs, more focused on securing resources for offspring, more calculating in mate selection. This makes them, in his view, more practical but less capable of abstract thought, more manipulative in relationships, more driven by biological imperatives than philosophical truth. These passages in his work are painful to read now, and they were controversial even in his time, but they're consistent with his larger view. The will uses sex to perpetuate itself. Women's biology makes them more thoroughly instruments of this process, and the whole system is a trap that wise men should try to escape or at least understand. Nietzsche approaches all this from a completely different angle. He also never married, also had complicated relationships with women, also wrote things about gender that remain controversial. But his framework is not biological determinism serving a cosmic will. It's about power, creation, and the transformation of drives. Nietzsche sees sexual energy as life force, not as trap. It's the same fundamental energy that drives creation, achievement, artistic production. You don't escape it or see through it, you channel it, redirect it, transmute it into higher forms. He has this concept called sublimation, borrowed later by Freud. Sexual energy doesn't have to express itself sexually. It can be transformed into creative work, intellectual achievement, artistic production. The energy is the same, but it gets redirected toward cultural creation instead of biological reproduction. This is why Nietzsche thinks many great creators were celibate or had minimal sex lives, not because they were repressing unhealthy urges, but because they were using that energy for something else. The power that could make children instead makes art, philosophy, music, innovation. And this means sexuality isn't primarily about the species perpetuating itself. It's about individual power expressing itself. The question isn't whether to serve the will's reproductive agenda. The question is what you do with your drives, your energies, your desires. You can spend them on reproduction, or you can transmute them into creation. Nietzsche is also deeply suspicious of romantic love, but for different reasons than Schopenhauer. He thinks modern romantic love is a Christian invention. This idea that you merge with another person, lose yourself in union, find completion through relationship. He sees this as another form of the weakness Christianity promotes. The strong individual doesn't need to merge with someone else. They don't seek completion through another. They use relationship as an enhancement of their own power, or they remain alone. There's a passage in Thus Spoke Zarathustra about marriage that's revealing. Nietzsche says marriage should be two people creating together, choosing to build something beyond themselves, not two incomplete halves making a whole. The question shouldn't be, does this person complete me? But can we create together something neither could create alone? This shifts everything about how you think about relationships. Schopenhauer says sexual attraction is the will tricking you for reproductive purposes. Nietzsche says sexual attraction is life energy that you can use for reproduction or for creation. One views it as deception to escape, the other views it as energy to redirect. And Nietzsche's view of women is more complex than Schopenhauer's, though not necessarily more progressive by modern standards. He thinks women have been systematically diminished by Christian culture, forced into subservient roles, denied access to power and achievement. But his solution isn't equality in the modern sense. It's that women should develop their own form of strength, their own type of power, not imitate men. He's suspicious of the early feminist movements he witnessed, seeing them as women trying to become like men rather than developing their distinctive excellence. He wants what he calls warrior women, though he's never entirely clear what this means. Women who are strong in their own way, who don't need protection or equality but claim power directly. This is, to put it mildly, problematic to modern ears. But it's consistent with his larger view that equality is a false goal. The question shouldn't be whether men and women are equal, but how both can achieve their highest possibilities. And he suspects these possibilities might be different, not in a way that justifies subordination, but in a way that honors genuine difference. Both philosophers notice that reproduction and culture are in tension. Schopenhauer says reproduction is the will's trap that keeps you locked in the cycle of suffering and prevents the contemplative withdrawal necessary for wisdom. Nietzsche says reproduction uses energy that could go toward cultural creation, so the highest individuals often sacrifice family for achievement. But again, opposite valuations. For Schopenhauer, this is evidence that biological life and meaningful life are incompatible, that the will's reproductive agenda conflicts with human flourishing. For Nietzsche, this is just reality's necessity that you choose what to do with limited energy, that great creation requires sacrifice of other possibilities. And both were frankly writing from positions of personal failure in this domain. Neither had successful romantic relationships, neither had children, neither experienced family life. They were theorizing about something they'd chosen or been forced to live without. Schopenhauer turned this into philosophy of why it's better to be without it. The wise person sees through sex's illusions and either remains celibate or engages minimally, always aware it's the will's trap. He rationalized his isolation as enlightenment. Nietzsche turned this into philosophy of the cost of greatness. The creator sacrifices ordinary human connections for the sake of their work. He rationalized his isolation as necessity for achievement. Both might have been making virtues of necessity, explaining why they didn't have what they couldn't get. Or both might have been genuinely seeing something others miss, that the deepest thought and highest creation require distance from ordinary life, including its sexual and reproductive dimensions. The question of sublimation is crucial here. Can sexual energy really be redirected toward cultural creation, or is this just repression with sophisticated vocabulary? Freud would later make this central to psychoanalysis, arguing that civilization depends on sublimating sexual drives into socially productive activities. Nietzsche anticipates this but values it differently. He thinks sublimation isn't repression, it's transformation. The energy doesn't get bottled up creating neurosis, it gets transmuted into a higher form. Like water turning to steam, same substance but capable of powering different engines. Schopenhauer would see sublimation as temporary relief at best. You channel sexual energy into art or philosophy, but the underlying will to live doesn't change. You're still willing, just will different objects. The trap remains. And on homosexuality, both philosophers are products of their time and say almost nothing. Schopenhauer mentions it only to call it a perversion of the will's reproductive purpose, which in his framework should actually make it wise, but he doesn't follow this logic. Nietzsche barely addresses it directly, though some scholars read his friendship with Paul Ricoeur and others as having homoerotic dimensions. What both miss, limited by their historical moment, is that sexuality is more fluid and complex than their biological determinism or energy transmission models can account for. Desire doesn't simply serve reproduction or get neatly sublimated into creation. It's messier, more various, more central to identity than either philosopher grasped. But what remains provocative in both is the insistence that sex isn't just private pleasure or personal relationship. It's connected to fundamental questions about what human life is for, whether we're servants of biological perpetuation or creators of cultural meaning, whether the body's demands conflict with the soul's aspirations or provide energy for them. Sex, love, reproduction, the domain where philosophy and biology meet, where the individual and the species intersect, where both Schopenhauer and Nietzsche saw the will most naked and undeniable. One saw trap to escape, the other saw power to redirect. Both refused the comfortable stories about love and romance that their cultures told. Both insisted on seeing clearly even when the view was harsh. Schopenhauer wore his pessimism like armor. He called his philosophy pessimism proudly, defended it against all objections, built an entire worldview on the premise that existence is fundamentally suffering and always will be. This wasn't depression, he insisted, this was truth. The optimists were the deluded ones, seeing what they wanted to see rather than what was there. His evidence was everywhere. Look at nature. Creatures eating creatures, prey living in terror, predators living in hunger. Everyone suffering everyone else's suffering in the process of survival. Look at human life. Most people spend most of their time in want, in labor, in disappointment, with occasional brief moments of satisfaction, quickly giving way to new wants. Look at history. War, oppression, exploitation. The same patterns repeating endlessly because human nature doesn't change. And Schopenhauer had arguments. The optimist says life contains more pleasure than pain. He responds, if that were true, wouldn't people choose life over death more readily? Why do we need such strong survival instinct if life is so good? The fact that nature had to build such powerful fear of death suggests death might be preferable to life if we saw clearly. Or consider the asymmetry between pleasure and pain. Physical pain can reach intensities that physical pleasure never matches. You can suffer agonizing pain for hours or days, but intense pleasure is brief and followed by refractory periods. The very structure of sensation reveals that pain has greater range and duration than pleasure. More philosophically, pleasure is always relief from pain, absence of discomfort, while pain is positive and real. You only enjoy eating when you're hungry, only enjoy rest when you're tired, only enjoy satisfaction when you've been deprived. Remove the preceding lack and the pleasure disappears. This suggests pleasure is parasitic on pain, not an independent positive. So the balance sheet comes out negative. More suffering than satisfaction, and the suffering more intense than the satisfaction, and even the satisfaction dependent on preceding suffering. The optimist has to cook the books to make life seem worth living. But Schopenhauer's pessimism has a logical structure that's important. He's not saying life seems bad to me personally, or I feel depressed about existence. He's claiming to have discovered an objective truth about reality. The will is blind striving. Striving is suffering. Therefore, reality is fundamentally suffering. This is metaphysics, not mood. And it leads to a specific practical conclusion. Since existence is suffering and we can't eliminate the suffering without eliminating existence, the wise response is to minimize willing, to quiet the drives, to move toward renunciation. Not suicide, because suicide is just the will violently reasserting itself, but gradual withdrawal, progressive detachment, what Schopenhauer calls the denial of the will to live. This is pessimism as philosophy. It diagnoses, explains, and prescribes. The diagnosis, life is suffering. The explanation, because will is blind striving. The prescription, deny the will. Now watch how Nietzsche handles the same evidence and reaches a completely opposite conclusion. He agrees with almost everything in Schopenhauer's diagnosis. Yes, life contains enormous suffering. Yes, nature is violent and cruel. Yes, human existence involves constant struggle, disappointment, pain. Yes, satisfaction is brief and wanting is constant. Yes, history is mostly tragedy. All of this Nietzsche accepts completely, but he refuses the conclusion. He asks, what if the proper response to all this suffering isn't to wish there were less of it, but to become the kind of person who can affirm it? What if strength means saying yes to life precisely because it's difficult, dangerous, painful? This is what he means by tragic optimism, not the stupid optimism that denies suffering or thinks everything works out for the best. Not the shallow optimism that history is progressing or humanity is improving. Not optimism in any of those comfortable senses. Tragic optimism means life is exactly as terrible as the pessimist says, and yet it's worth affirming. The world is as brutal and meaningless as Schopenhauer claims, and yet we should say yes to it. Not despite the suffering, but including the suffering, as a necessary part of what makes life profound. Nietzsche's key move is to attack the value judgment underlying pessimism. Schopenhauer says, life is suffering, and suffering is bad, therefore life is bad. Nietzsche accepts the first premise and rejects the second. What if suffering isn't simply bad? What if some suffering is necessary for anything good? Think about every achievement you value: physical health, intellectual ability, artistic skill, moral character, meaningful relationships. All of them require effort, discipline, sometimes pain. Remove the difficulty and you remove the achievement. The suffering isn't incidental, it's constitutive. You can't have the good without the hard. So when Schopenhauer presents the evidence of life's difficulty as proof of its negative value, Nietzsche sees the same evidence as proof that life is challenging, which makes achievement meaningful. Easy victories don't feel valuable. Unearned gifts don't create pride. The very suffering that Schopenhauer cites as life's flaw is what gives life's triumphs their significance. This is the deepest disagreement between them. Not about the facts, but about the framework for evaluating facts. One says, suffering is bad, therefore more suffering means worse existence. The other says, suffering is the price of significance, therefore a profound existence will contain profound suffering. And Nietzsche has his own arguments. He points to the ancient Greeks, who knew suffering as well as anyone. They created tragedies that looked straight at life's horror. But they didn't conclude life should be rejected. They concluded life could be made bearable and even beautiful through art, through competition, through excellence. They transformed suffering through form. The Greeks provide Nietzsche's model for tragic optimism. They said yes to life with their eyes open. They didn't need illusions about afterlife or progress or cosmic justice. They faced the terror and created beauty anyway. This is what Nietzsche wants to recover: the ability to affirm life without needing it to be other than it is. But there's something subtle in Nietzsche's position that's easy to miss. He's not saying you should feel happy about suffering. He's not recommending masochism. He's saying you should will it, choose it, affirm it as necessary for what you value. The attitude is more like a warrior's acceptance of battle than a slave's resignation to punishment. Think of an athlete training for competition. The training is painful, exhausting, sometimes injurious. If you asked purely about pleasure and pain, they'd have to say training involves more pain than pleasure, but they choose it anyway because the goal matters more than comfort. They affirm the suffering as the price of the achievement. Nietzsche wants to generalize this attitude to existence as a whole. Not every moment needs to be pleasant. Not every experience needs to maximize happiness. The question is whether your life as a whole is something you can affirm, whether you're becoming who you want to be, whether you're creating what you want to create. And this is where his thought experiment of eternal recurrence becomes crucial. Imagine you had to live your life again, exactly as it was, infinite times. Same joys, same sufferings, same mistakes, same achievements, forever. Could you bear this? Could you want this? Schopenhauer's answer would be an immediate no. Living once is already too much suffering. Infinite repetition would be infinite torture. The thought experiment confirms pessimism. Nietzsche's answer is that the ability to say yes to eternal recurrence is the test of life affirmation. If you can will your life to repeat forever, including all the suffering, then you're living in a way that deserves affirmation. If you can't, then you need to change your life until you can. This shifts the entire question. Instead of asking, does life contain more pleasure than pain? You ask, is your life something you can fully affirm? Instead of passive calculation, active evaluation. Instead of what happens to you, what you make of what happens to you. But Schopenhauer would say this is just the will rationalizing itself again. Of course, Nietzsche wants to justify willing. He's in the grip of the will. The very fact that he feels the need to affirm life proves he feels the negative weight of existence. Otherwise, why the need for such strenuous affirmation? And there's something to this. Nietzsche's philosophy does seem to require enormous effort. You have to constantly overcome yourself, constantly create, constantly say yes against the temptation to say no. It's exhausting in a way that Schopenhauer's resignation might not be. Nietzsche would respond, yes, it's difficult, that's the point. Easy paths lead to mediocrity. Meaningful existence is hard. The person who achieves greatness pays in suffering. But the suffering is worth it because the achievement is real. This creates a strange symmetry. Both philosophers acknowledge that their path is difficult. Schopenhauer admits that genuine denial of the will is rare, that most people can't achieve it, that even he only accomplished it partially. Nietzsche admits that genuine self-overcoming is rare, that most people choose comfortable weakness, that even he struggled with it constantly. Both are demanding philosophies. Neither offers easy comfort. But one says the difficulty is in escaping life's trap. The other says the difficulty is in fully embracing life's challenge. And both thought their contemporaries were deluded, but in opposite directions. Schopenhauer thought 19th century Europe was too optimistic, believing in progress and improvement while ignoring fundamental suffering. Nietzsche thought it was too pessimistic, giving up on greatness and settling for comfort and equality. The pessimist versus the tragic optimist. Same observation of suffering, opposite valuations. One makes suffering the evidence that existence is a mistake. The other makes suffering the evidence that existence is profound. One seeks escape through denial, the other seeks meaning through affirmation. One says the ultimate wisdom is to stop willing, the other says the ultimate wisdom is to will completely, including the suffering that will brings. And neither position is emotionally easy. Schopenhauer's pessimism could slide into depression if you focused only on the diagnosis without achieving the detachment he prescribed. Nietzsche's tragic optimism could slide into exhausted striving if you tried to constantly overcome yourself without achieving the joy he promised. But both refused the middle path, the comfortable illusion that life is basically fine if you just arrange things correctly. Both insisted on looking at existence clearly, seeing the suffering honestly, and then making a choice about how to respond. The pessimist chose no, the tragic optimist chose yes. And everything else in their philosophies flows from that fundamental orientation toward life itself. Richard Wagner is the figure who connects these two philosophers most intimately, and understanding the Wagner relationship reveals something crucial about how Schopenhauer's philosophy infected Nietzsche and how Nietzsche eventually tried to inoculate himself. Schopenhauer never met Wagner. He died in 1860 when Wagner was still developing his mature style, but Wagner read The World as Will and Representation in the 1850s, and it transformed his understanding of what he was doing. Wagner was working on Tristan und Isolde at the time, and Schopenhauer's philosophy gave him a framework for what he was trying to express musically. Wagner saw in Schopenhauer's philosophy vindication of music's supreme importance. If music is, as Schopenhauer claimed, the direct expression of the will itself, bypassing the world of representation entirely, then Wagner's project of making music central to drama was philosophically justified. Opera shouldn't be drama with musical decoration. It should be music made visible through drama. More specifically, Tristan becomes a Schopenhauerian work. It's about love as the will's trap, about desire creating suffering, about the impossibility of fulfillment in life, and ultimately about transcendence through death. The lovers can't be united in life because life is individuation, separation. Only in death, only by extinguishing individual existence, can they achieve the union they desire. The final Liebestod, love-death, is pure Schopenhauer, the denial of the will to live as the only real resolution. Wagner sent his published work to Schopenhauer in 1854 with a letter of devotion. Schopenhauer barely acknowledged it. He wasn't interested in opera and didn't think much of what he'd heard of Wagner's music. This must have hurt Wagner deeply, to receive indifference from the philosopher who had become his intellectual guide. But Wagner persisted in his Schopenhauerian phase. He wrote essays explaining his operas in Schopenhauerian terms. He planned to create a new art form that would express Schopenhauer's philosophy more adequately than words could. He became the composer of pessimism. Then comes Nietzsche, 20 years younger than Wagner, meeting him in 1868 when Nietzsche is 24 and Wagner is 55. Nietzsche is already soaked in Schopenhauer, already thinking of life in Schopenhauerian terms. And here's Wagner, the only living artist who seems to understand what Schopenhauer understood, who's creating works that embody this dark wisdom. Nietzsche becomes a regular visitor to Wagner's house. They discuss philosophy, music, the future of German culture. Wagner treats the young professor with unusual respect, sees in him a potential philosophical spokesperson for his artistic project. Nietzsche experiences something like discipleship, both to Schopenhauer's philosophy and to Wagner's embodiment of that philosophy in art. The Birth of Tragedy, Nietzsche's first book in 1872, is essentially an attempt to provide philosophical justification for Wagner's project. Greek tragedy was the perfect fusion of Dionysian music and Apollonian form, Nietzsche argues. It declined when Socrates introduced rationalism. And now Wagner is reviving tragedy for the modern age, returning music to its proper central place. The book is dedicated to Wagner, and it's soaked in Schopenhauer's framework. Art as temporary salvation from suffering, music as the deepest art because it expresses the will directly, tragedy as the highest form because it faces horror honestly. Young Nietzsche is channeling his two teachers, the dead philosopher and the living composer. But already in The Birth of Tragedy, there's the seed of what will become Nietzsche's break with both. He keeps describing how the Greeks faced terrible truth about existence and yet created beauty anyway. They didn't resign, they affirmed. They said yes to life even while seeing clearly its tragic character. This is not quite Schopenhauerian. Schopenhauer's tragedy shows us the futility of willing, so we'll want to stop. Nietzsche's tragedy somehow makes us want to continue, makes life bearable through beauty. Wagner was initially pleased with the birth of tragedy, but other people were not. The academic establishment attacked it viciously. Nietzsche's colleagues in philology dismissed it as unscholarly speculation. Nietzsche's reputation as a promising young classicist was damaged, possibly permanently. And Wagner's response to this crisis revealed something. He didn't defend Nietzsche vigorously. He let the academic attacks happen. He was more concerned with his own festival at Bayreuth, with raising money, with political connections. Nietzsche noticed this. The master was less devoted to the disciple than the disciple to the master. Meanwhile, Nietzsche was developing health problems, terrible headaches, eye pain, digestive issues. He spent increasing time alone, away from academic duties, living in Swiss and Italian pensions, trying to manage his condition. And in this isolation, he started thinking differently. The turning point was the opening of Wagner's Festival Theater at Bayreuth in 1876. Nietzsche attended the first complete performance of Wagner's Ring Cycle. This should have been a triumph, the culmination of everything they'd worked toward. But Nietzsche was disturbed by what he saw. The audience was full of Prussian military officers, wealthy patrons, fashionable society. The atmosphere was nationalist, self-congratulatory, the opposite of tragic wisdom. Wagner's art was being consumed as entertainment for the very culture both philosophers had criticized, and Wagner seemed to enjoy this success, to court it. Nietzsche left Bayreuth early, claiming illness. He didn't tell Wagner the real reason. He was starting to see Wagner's art as decadent, as complicit with the cultural decline they were supposed to oppose. The music was too seductive, the emotions too easy, the effect too much like intoxication, and not enough like insight. Over the next few years, the break became explicit. Nietzsche published Human, All Too Human in 1878, a book that rejected metaphysics, rejected Schopenhauer's will, rejected romantic genius, rejected everything the birth of tragedy stood for. He sent Wagner a copy. Wagner was furious. Their friendship ended, and Nietzsche started analyzing what had gone wrong. He'd loved Wagner's music because it seemed to express Schopenhauerian wisdom, the tragedy of existence, the impossibility of fulfillment, the beauty of resignation. But he came to think this was exactly the problem. The music was making people feel deep without actually making them strong. It was pessimism as art form, seductive weakness. Parsifal, Wagner's final opera, confirmed Nietzsche's worst fears. It was explicitly Christian, about redemption through compassion, about renunciation of sexuality, about priestly wisdom. Everything Nietzsche was coming to oppose. Wagner had gone from Schopenhauerian Buddhism to Christian mysticism, and in Nietzsche's view, both were forms of life denial. So Nietzsche's later attacks on Wagner became savage. He calls Wagner a disease, calls his music decadent, calls his success a symptom of cultural decline. This isn't just philosophical disagreement, it's personal. Nietzsche had loved Wagner, had seen in him a path to understanding, and now felt betrayed. But what exactly was the betrayal? Wagner didn't change. He was always creating art of resignation, of longing for transcendence, of pessimism beautifully expressed. What changed was Nietzsche's evaluation of whether this was valuable. Under Schopenhauer's framework, Wagner's art was perfect. It expressed the will's tragedy, gave temporary aesthetic relief, pointed toward renunciation as the solution. Under Nietzsche's emerging framework, Wagner's art was dangerous. It made weakness attractive, resignation beautiful, life denial seductive. And this reveals something about how Nietzsche's break with Schopenhauer happened. It wasn't primarily through argument. It was through aesthetic experience, through coming to feel differently about what Wagner's music was doing. He stopped finding it elevating and started finding it enervating. He stopped experiencing it as truth and started experiencing it as temptation. Nietzsche later wrote that he measured philosophy by whether it made him stronger or weaker. Did it increase his capacity for life or diminish it? And Wagner's music, he decided, made him weaker. It made him want to escape, to dissolve, to give up. It was the sound of Schopenhauer's philosophy, and it was poison precisely because it was beautiful poison. So Nietzsche started praising Bizet's Carmen instead, calling it healthier music. This is almost certainly not true as objective aesthetic judgment, but it's true as personal testimony. Nietzsche needed art that stimulated rather than sedated, that made him want to dance rather than die, that said yes to life's passions rather than resolving them in renunciation. Wagner sits in the middle of this story as both connector and dividing line. He He connected Nietzsche to Schopenhauer by embodying Schopenhauer's philosophy in art, and he became the focal point where Nietzsche had to choose. Was Schopenhauer right about life being suffering that we should escape, or was there another possibility? Wagner chose Schopenhauer's path, made it sublime, made it irresistible through beauty. And Nietzsche, precisely because he felt that beauty's pull so strongly, had to resist it even more forcefully. He had to call Wagner's art decadent, not despite its beauty, but because of it, because the beauty was making the wrong message attractive. And there's something tragic in Nietzsche's later reminiscences about Wagner. He admits he loved the music even while diagnosing it as dangerous. He describes the pull of Wagner's sound world as something he had to actively fight against. It wasn't that he stopped finding it beautiful, he stopped trusting beauty that led toward resignation. This is the personal drama underlying the philosophical shift. Schopenhauer was an abstract teacher, read in books. Wagner was a living presence, a friendship, an aesthetic experience. Breaking with Wagner meant breaking with Schopenhauer not just intellectually, but emotionally, viscerally, in the register of actual feeling. 3 Germans, 3 generations, 3 responses to the problem of suffering. Schopenhauer diagnosed it and prescribed resignation. Wagner transformed it into art and made resignation beautiful. Nietzsche saw the beauty, felt its appeal, recognized it as the same life denial Schopenhauer taught, and decided he had to affirm life anyway, even without that beautiful consolation. Wagner in the middle, between the pessimist philosopher and the tragic optimist, embodying the question, should art help us escape life or engage more deeply with it? Should beauty lead toward transcendence or toward intensity? Should the highest music make us want to die or make us want to dance? Nietzsche chose dance, Wagner chose death, and Schopenhauer, who never heard Wagner's mature music, had already written the philosophy that Wagner's swans were singing. Schopenhauer had a theory about history that was brutally simple. There isn't one. Not in the sense that events don't happen, obviously they do, but in the sense that history has no direction, no development, no progress. The same fundamental patterns repeat endlessly because human nature doesn't change. Read Herodotus, he said, and you're reading about the same jealousies, ambitions, cruelties, and stupidities that fill today's newspapers. Read Shakespeare and you're seeing the same passions that drive contemporary people. The costumes change, the technologies change, but the underlying will expressing itself through human action remains identical. This makes history, as a discipline, somewhat pointless in Schopenhauer's view. You don't learn profound truths by studying historical events. You learn particular facts about particular times. But these don't reveal anything new about human nature. For that, you're better off reading great literature, which shows universal patterns more clearly than historical chronicles. Schopenhauer put this directly. History shows us only the same thing in different forms. Wars happen because the will drives nations into conflict. Revolutions happen because the will in the oppressed rises against the will in the oppressors. New empires emerge and fall because the will's striving is endless and pointless. Changing circumstances don't change fundamental reality. This is why Schopenhauer was hostile to Hegel's philosophy of history. Hegel claimed history was the rational unfolding of absolute spirit, that each era resolved contradictions of previous eras, that we were progressing toward ultimate freedom and self-knowledge. Schopenhauer thought this was elaborate delusion. History is circular, not linear. We're not going anywhere. The will just keeps grinding. Even time itself in Schopenhauer's framework is part of the illusory world of representation. The thing in itself, the will, is timeless. It doesn't develop or evolve. What looks like change is just the same will manifesting through different forms. Underneath all temporal appearance is unchanging metaphysical reality. This has an interesting implication for individual life. Your existence in time is illusory. The real you is the will, which is timeless. So your death doesn't matter in the way you think it does. What dies is the individual form, the temporary manifestation. The will continues. In a sense, you've always existed and will always exist, just not as this particular individuation. Schopenhauer finds this both comforting and terrifying. Comforting because death isn't total annihilation. Terrifying because it means the suffering continues, just in different forms. You might die, but the will doesn't, and the will manifest as other suffering beings. In a strange way, their suffering is your suffering because beneath the illusion of separateness, it's all one will. This makes Schopenhauer sympathetic to Indian ideas about reincarnation, though he doesn't believe in literal personal rebirth. The deeper truth is impersonal. The will reincarnates endlessly through new living beings. Stop thinking of yourself as a separate individual, and you realize you're part of this endless process. The question becomes whether to continue participating or opt out through denial of the will. Now watch Nietzsche approach these same questions from a completely different angle. He also rejects Hegelian progress. He also thinks history doesn't have inherent meaning or direction. But where Schopenhauer concluded history is therefore futile, Nietzsche sees opportunity. If history has no predetermined path, then human creativity can shape it. We're not discovering history's purpose. We're creating purposes through our actions. This is the key shift. For Schopenhauer, meaningless history confirms pessimism. For Nietzsche, meaningless history enables creation. There's no script we're following, no cosmic plan unfolding. This means we're free to impose our own meaning, our own values, our own direction. And Nietzsche has his own shocking thought about time, eternal recurrence. Imagine that time is infinite and cyclical. Everything that has happened will happen again, exactly the same way, infinitely. This includes your life. Every moment you've lived will recur endlessly, in precise detail, forever. This is not a cosmological theory Nietzsche claims is literally true. It's a thought experiment, a test. If you knew your life would repeat infinitely, would you despair or rejoice? Would you want to change everything or affirm everything? Schopenhauer would find eternal recurrence to be the ultimate horror. Infinite suffering, infinite willing, infinite frustration, the same pain forever without hope of escape. It would be the final proof that existence should be denied, that the only sane response is to stop willing altogether. Nietzsche uses it as the opposite test. Can you love your life enough to will its eternal return? Can you affirm each moment so completely that you choose to live it again and again forever? This is the highest affirmation, beyond any reward or purpose beyond itself. Not living for some future goal, but loving each moment enough to want it eternally. The person who can say yes to eternal recurrence has achieved what Nietzsche calls amor fati, love of fate. They love their life, including its suffering, its failures, its difficulties. Not because these things are secretly good, but because they're part of the whole and they love the whole. This completely inverts Schopenhauer's relationship to time. For Schopenhauer, time is the prison of individuation, the form through which the will traps us in endless striving. Liberation means escaping time's grip. For Nietzsche, time is the medium of creation, the field where we make our lives into works of art. Mastery means affirming time completely. And their different views on history flow from this. Schopenhauer sees history as repetition confirming unchanging will. Nietzsche sees history as variation showing human creativity. Same events happening again don't prove futility, they prove patterns. And patterns can be understood, used, transformed. Nietzsche wants to use history actively, not just study it passively. He distinguishes three types of history. Monumental, which celebrates great achievements to inspire current action. Antiquarian, which preserves the past for its own sake. Critical, which judges the past to free ourselves from it. Each type serves present life differently. But all three types assume history is for the living, should serve present purposes. Nietzsche attacks the scholarly history of his time for collecting facts without asking what they're for, what values they serve, how they help us live. History shouldn't be objective contemplation of the past. It should be active use of the past for creating the future. Schopenhauer would see this as the will rationalizing itself again. Of course, Nietzsche wants to use history, wants to create, wants to impose meaning. He's driven by will to power, dressing up blind striving as conscious purpose. The supposed freedom to create values is just the will's illusion. You're not free, you're driven. Nietzsche would respond, even if we're driven, we can direct the drive. Even if the energy comes from unconscious sources, we can channel it consciously. The will to power isn't blind like Schopenhauer's will to live. It's capable of self-direction, self-overcoming transformation. This brings us to perhaps the deepest difference. Schopenhauer's will is one thing, uniform, without development or differentiation. It doesn't learn or grow, it just manifests. Nietzsche's will to power is plural, competitive, evolutionary. Different wills to power compete, and through competition, new forms emerge. There's development, even if it's not progress toward a goal. Think of it biologically. Schopenhauer sees all of evolution as the will trying different forms to perpetuate itself, but the will itself never changes, never improves. It's just blind mechanism. Nietzsche sees evolution as creating genuinely new possibilities, new types of organization, new capacities. The will to power in a human is different from the will to power in an amoeba, not just in form, but in what it can do. This makes time meaningful differently. For Schopenhauer, time is the form in which the timeless will appears. For Nietzsche, time is where actual transformation happens, where new configurations of power emerge, where creation occurs. An eternal recurrence takes on a different meaning in this context. It's not just asking, can you bear your life repeating infinitely? It's asking, are you creating something worthy of eternal affirmation? It's a challenge to make your life into something that deserves to recur, that would be valuable even in infinite repetition. Both philosophers are asking what to do with the fact that life has no inherent meaning, that history has no predetermined purpose, that time isn't carrying us toward salvation. But Schopenhauer concludes we should minimize our participation in meaningless process. Nietzsche concludes we should maximize our creative use of meaningless freedom. Schopenhauer wants escape from time into timeless contemplation and eventual denial of the will. Nietzsche wants immersion in time as the field of creative transformation. One sees time as trap, the other as opportunity. One values the eternal as escape from temporal change, the other values the temporal as the site where eternal values are created. And this connects to their different views on death. Schopenhauer says individual death doesn't matter because the will continues, which should comfort you, but also shows the pointlessness of individual existence. Your particular life isn't important, just another temporary manifestation. Nietzsche says individual death matters enormously because your unique configuration of will to power dies with you, making your life precious exactly because it's finite and unrepeatable. One uses the continuity of will to minimize the significance of individual existence. The other uses the finitude of individual existence to maximize its intensity and value. Same metaphysical facts about impermanence, opposite evaluations of what this means for how to live. The question of eternal return brings this to a point. Would you want your life repeated infinitely? Schopenhauer's honest answer is no. Life once is already suffering enough. Infinity would be hell. Nietzsche's demanded answer is yes. If you truly affirm life, if you've lived well, if you've created something worthy, you should want it again and again. Time, history, eternal return, the questions of whether existence has direction and whether repetition is curse or blessing. Schopenhauer sees cyclical meaninglessness and prescribes escape. Nietzsche sees cyclical possibility and prescribes creation. Same diagnosis of history's aimlessness, opposite prescriptions for what humans should do in a directionless universe. Schopenhauer was writing in a Europe where Christianity still dominated culturally, even if Enlightenment thinkers had undermined it philosophically. He personally rejected Christian metaphysics completely. The personal God, the creation story, the afterlife, all of it he dismissed as anthropomorphic fantasy. But he was doing this in 1818, when such rejection still felt dangerous, still required courage. His atheism came from philosophical conviction. If the thing in itself is blind will, there's no room for a personal deity with plans and purposes. If the world is suffering rather than divine creation, Christianity's theology collapses. If wisdom means denying the will to live, Christian values of life affirmation and procreation are backwards. But Schopenhauer was careful in how he expressed this. He praised Christianity's ethics while rejecting its dogmas. He pointed to Christian saints and ascetics as examples of those who had achieved denial of the will. He suggested Christianity had stumbled upon certain truths about suffering and renunciation, even if it wrapped them in false metaphysics. This created a strange position. Schopenhauer, the atheist, praising Christian practices while denying Christian beliefs. He wanted the asceticism without the God, the renunciation without the resurrection, the ethics without the theodicy. He thought you could extract Christianity's psychological insights from its theological framework. And he lived in a culture where this was possible. Most educated Europeans of his generation weren't deeply religious, but they maintained Christian forms, Christian morality, Christian cultural practices. You could be a philosophical atheist and still live in a basically Christian society. The death of God hadn't yet become a cultural crisis. Nietzsche was born into a different situation. By the 1870s and 1880s, the Enlightenment's anti-Christian arguments had won among intellectuals. Nobody Nietzsche knew actually believed in Christian metaphysics anymore, but they kept Christian morality, Christian values, Christian ethics. This struck Nietzsche as dishonest and unsustainable. If you've killed God, you can't keep his commandments. If you've rejected the theological foundation, the moral structure collapses too. You can't be an atheist and still believe in Christian values like equality, compassion, humility. Those values only make sense within a Christian worldview. This is what Nietzsche means by the death of God. Not just that God doesn't exist, Schopenhauer had already said that, but that God's death has consequences we haven't faced yet. The entire value system built on Christian assumptions becomes unstable. We're living in the shadow of a dead God, pretending the shadow is real. And Nietzsche's famous announcement in The Gay Science, God is dead, God remains dead, and we have killed him. This isn't triumphant atheism, it's a diagnosis of cultural catastrophe. We've killed God without understanding what we've done. We've removed the foundation of Western values without building a replacement. The madman in Nietzsche's parable asks, how could we drink up the sea? Who gave us the sponge to wipe away the entire horizon? The death of God isn't just a change in belief, it's a cosmic event. It ungrounds everything that seems certain. Morality, meaning, purpose, value, all of it was built on God's existence. Remove God and we're in free fall. But Nietzsche's response to this crisis is completely different from Schopenhauer's. Schopenhauer looked at a godless universe and found only blind will, meaningless striving, universal suffering. His atheism led to pessimism. The absence of God confirmed that existence is something to escape. Nietzsche looked at the same godless universe and saw freedom. No God means no predetermined meaning, which means we can create meaning. No divine plan means history is open, our actions matter, the future is unwritten. His atheism led to something between excitement and terror. This is the before and after of the death of God. Before Nietzsche, atheist philosophers like Schopenhauer could still operate within basically Christian moral frameworks. They rejected God but kept treating life as something problematic, suffering as something to minimize, renunciation as wise. Christianity's values persisted after Christianity's God departed. After Nietzsche, or rather after the cultural shift Nietzsche diagnosed and accelerated, atheism had to face its full implications. Without God, why compassion? Why equality? Why truth? Why any of the values we'd inherited? Each value had to be examined for what purposes it served, what type of life it promoted. And Nietzsche's answer was that Christian values, even when maintained by atheists like Schopenhauer, were life-denying. They'd been designed for a different context, where suffering in this life made sense because of reward in the next. Remove the afterlife and the values become pathological. They make you suffer without compensation. This is why Nietzsche attacks Schopenhauer's ethics so ferociously. Schopenhauer had removed God but kept the Christian valuation of suffering, renunciation, compassion, denial. He'd secularized Christian morality by giving it a philosophical foundation in the will. But this just preserved the same life denial under new management. Nietzsche wanted something harder, to actually face the death of God, to actually rebuild values from the ground up, to actually create new morality for a godless world. Not keep Christian values with atheist justification, but ask from scratch what values enhance life, what virtues make humans greater, what morality serves the future rather than the past. This is the revaluation of all values, Nietzsche's central project. Take every value Christianity and its secular derivatives have taught you and evaluate it freshly. Is compassion actually good? Is equality actually valuable? Is humility actually virtuous? Don't assume the answers. Derive them from a new principle. Does this value enhance life or diminish it? Schopenhauer never attempted this. He took it as obvious that suffering is bad and should be minimized, that compassion is good and should be cultivated, that desire is problematic and should be denied. These are all basically Christian values secularized. He never questioned whether an affirmative morality, a life-enhancing ethics, might value different things, and Nietzsche saw something psychological in this. He thought atheists who kept Christian morality were motivated by resentment against life. They'd killed God intellectually but still felt the same negative disposition toward existence that Christianity had taught. They wanted to say no to life but couldn't justify it religiously anymore, so they justified it philosophically instead. Schopenhauer becomes the example of this. He's too honest to believe in Christian mythology, but he's too life-denying to embrace atheism's freedom, so he creates a philosophical system that reaches the same practical conclusion as Christianity. Life is suffering, renunciation is wisdom, existence would be better if it weren't, atheist metaphysics supporting Christian ethics. But there's something Nietzsche struggled with here. If God is dead, if we're creating values rather than discovering them, why should we choose life-affirming values? Why is Nietzsche's revaluation better than Schopenhauer's? If there's no objective foundation, aren't all value systems equally arbitrary? Nietzsche never fully solved this problem, and he knew it. He couldn't say his values were objectively true because he'd rejected objective truth. He couldn't say they were God's commands because God is dead. The best he could say was, these values are better for a certain type of life, for people who want to ascend rather than decline, for those who choose affirmation over negation. But this makes it relative to choice, and Schopenhauer had chosen differently, chosen resignation. By what standard could Nietzsche say this choice was wrong? Not by logical argument, because Schopenhauer's system was internally consistent. Not by appeal to God or nature or reason, because Nietzsche had undermined all those foundations. The answer Nietzsche gave was essentially aesthetic and physiological. Life-affirming values come from health, strength, ascending life. Life-denying values come from sickness, weakness, declining life. Schopenhauer's pessimism was a symptom of 19th century German exhaustion. Nietzsche's affirmation was an attempt at cultural therapy. But this doesn't solve the philosophical problem. A dying person could say, yes, my values come from decline, and that's appropriate for me. Why should I adopt values suited to healthy people when I'm not healthy? Schopenhauer was often sick, often in pain. Maybe his philosophy was appropriate for his condition. Nietzsche's response would be, even sick people can choose whether to affirm or deny their sickness, whether to fight or surrender, whether to create beauty from their suffering or just suffer. Even in decline, you can choose ascending values. But this assumes ascending is better than declining, which brings us back to the same question. The death of God creates this abyss of value creation. Both philosophers looked into it. Schopenhauer turned away, built a system that felt secure by denying life. Nietzsche jumped in, tried to create values in midair, hoped the very act of creation would be its own justification. And this is still the situation philosophy finds itself in. After the death of God, announced by Nietzsche, prepared by Schopenhauer, what do we value and why? Can there be ethics without theological foundation? Can there be meaning without cosmic purpose? Can there be truth without objective ground? Schopenhauer said, God is an illusion, but the wise response to a godless universe is resignation. Nietzsche said, God is dead, and the brave response to a godless universe is creation. Same godless universe, opposite responses. One found only suffering in the absence of God, the other found terrible freedom, and both were writing before the full cultural impact of atheism had hit. They were philosophers preparing Europe for what was coming, though neither could have predicted how completely the Christian framework would collapse in the 20th century. Schopenhauer prepared the pessimistic response. If God is dead, life is revealed as meaningless suffering. Nietzsche prepared the creative response. If God is dead, we must become gods ourselves, creating the values that make existence worthwhile. The death of God before and after. Before Nietzsche, it was a philosophical position compatible with traditional values. After Nietzsche, it was a cultural crisis requiring new values. Schopenhauer represented the before, keeping Christian ethics in an atheist framework. Nietzsche represented the after, demanding new ethics for a godless age. Between them, the transition from stable atheism to abyssal freedom, from the death of God as intellectual conclusion to the death of God as existential challenge. Schopenhauer was writing at the cusp of the scientific age. Darwin hadn't published yet. The modern scientific worldview was emerging but hadn't yet become dominant. Schopenhauer tried to position his philosophy as compatible with science, even as grounded in science in certain ways. He starts the world as will and representation with an analysis of representation of how the mind structures experience. This is almost proto-scientific, acknowledging that what we perceive isn't reality directly, but reality filtered through our perceptive apparatus. Space, time, causality, these are forms the mind imposes on raw data. This puts him in conversation with Kant, who had made similar arguments about the mind's active role in constructing experience. But Schopenhauer goes further. He says science can only ever study the world of representation, the phenomenal world, the world as it appears to us. Science can discover causal laws, predict phenomena, manipulate nature, but it can't penetrate to the thing in itself. That requires philosophy. Only philosophical insight can recognize the thing in itself as will. Science tells us how things appear and interact. Philosophy tells us what things fundamentally are. Science gives us instrumental knowledge. Philosophy gives us truth. And Schopenhauer thinks this truth is horrible. The more clearly you see reality, the worse it looks. Science's progress just makes the horror more detailed. You discover how nature works and it's all eating and being eaten, struggling and dying, blind mechanism without purpose or compassion. Scientific knowledge confirms pessimism. But Schopenhauer also acknowledges science's value for reducing suffering. Medical science alleviates pain. Engineering makes life more comfortable. Understanding nature gives us some control over circumstances. He's not anti-science. He just thinks science operates in the realm of representation and can't address the fundamental problem, that the will drives us to suffer. Now watch Nietzsche come along and attack the entire framework. He questions whether truth is actually valuable. This is radical. Western philosophy from Socrates onward had assumed truth is good, knowledge is valuable. We should seek reality rather than illusion. Nietzsche asks, why? What if truth is harmful? What if some illusions are necessary for life? He gives examples. We live as if we're unified selves, but closer analysis shows we're multiplicities of competing drives. We live as if things have stable identities, but everything is actually flux and process. We live as if our values are objective, but they're human creations. These are all illusions in some sense, departures from strict truth, but they're necessary for life. Remove the illusion of self and you can't act as an agent. Remove the illusion of stable objects and you can't navigate the world. Remove the illusion of objective values and you have no guide for action. Truth might actually be incompatible with life. This completely undermines Schopenhauer's project. Schopenhauer thought philosophical truth about the will was the highest achievement, even though it revealed life as suffering. The wise person sees truth clearly and responds with resignation. But Nietzsche asks, what if this truth is itself a human interpretation and not even a life-enhancing one? Maybe Schopenhauer's philosophy isn't truth about reality, it's a symptom of Schopenhauer's constitution. Maybe his will is a fiction he invented to make sense of his pessimistic temperament. Maybe his whole system is a projection of personal exhaustion onto the cosmos. Nietzsche introduces perspectivism. All knowledge is knowledge from some perspective, serving some interest, shaped by some set of values. There's no view from nowhere, no objective knowledge independent of the knower. Even science's supposedly objective truth is truth from a particular perspective, the perspective that values prediction and control. This doesn't make science wrong or useless. It makes science one tool among others, valuable for certain purposes, but not giving access to ultimate reality. Schopenhauer wanted philosophy to reveal what science couldn't reach. Nietzsche says both philosophy and science are human perspectives, useful fictions, pragmatic instruments. But if there's no objective truth, what constrains interpretation? Nietzsche's answer is life itself. Interpretations are tested by whether they enhance life or diminish it, not whether they are true in some correspondent sense, but whether they make the interpreter stronger or weaker, more capable or less capable. This is why Nietzsche calls Schopenhauer's philosophy life-denying, not because it's false, but because it weakens those who accept it. It makes them want less life, achieve less, create less. By Nietzsche's standard, that makes it a bad interpretation regardless of its truth value. Schopenhauer would be appalled by this pragmatism. He thought truth was truth regardless of whether it made you happy or sad, weak or strong. The will's blindness is true whether or not acknowledging this truth diminishes your life. Philosophy's job is to reveal reality, not to make reality palatable. And Schopenhauer would say Nietzsche's perspectivism is self-refuting. If there's no objective truth, then perspectivism itself isn't objectively true. It's just Nietzsche's perspective. Why should anyone accept it? Nietzsche can't claim his philosophy is true while denying truth exists. Nietzsche's response is that he's not claiming objective truth for perspectivism. He's offering it as a more useful way to think about knowledge. Instead of asking, is this true? Ask, what does this interpretation do? What type of life does it serve? What values does it promote? This shifts philosophy's project entirely. Schopenhauer wanted philosophy to discover metaphysical truth. Nietzsche wants philosophy to evaluate interpretations for their life consequences. One is pursuing knowledge of being, the other is pursuing diagnostics of value, and this affects their relationship to science specifically. Schopenhauer saw science as junior partner to philosophy. Science studies appearances, philosophy studies reality. Nietzsche sees science as one interpretation among others, valuable for its predictive power and technological applications, but not privileged in accessing truth. More provocatively, Nietzsche suggests science itself might be another form of the same will to truth that he's questioning. Why do we want truth? What drives the scientist's pursuit of knowledge? Maybe it's will to power expressing itself through intellectual mastery. Maybe science is just organized curiosity, the desire to understand as form of control. If so, then science doesn't escape the value question. It's not neutral truth-seeking. It's a particular way of relating to the world, motivated by particular drives, serving particular interests. And we should evaluate it not by whether it's true, but by what it does to us, what type of humans it creates, what form of life it enables. Schopenhauer would see this as dangerous relativism. If science doesn't give us truth about the natural world, what does it give us? If we can't trust scientific knowledge, how do we distinguish it from superstition or wishful thinking? Nietzsche would say science gives us effective models, useful predictions, technological power. These are real achievements. But they're achievements in the realm of human purposes, not revelations of mind-independent reality. Science works because it's a good tool, not because it's true in some absolute sense. This brings up the question of comfortable lies. Both philosophers think most people live by comfortable lies. Schopenhauer says people comfort themselves with optimistic illusions about life's meaning, progress, justice. The truth is that life is meaningless suffering, but people can't bear this truth, so they invent comforting stories. Nietzsche agrees people live by illusions, but questions whether truth is any better. Maybe some illusions are necessary and healthy. Maybe the person who sees through all illusions becomes paralyzed, unable to act. Maybe we need certain fictions to function. The question becomes which illusions to maintain. For Schopenhauer, all illusions that make you want to keep living are traps of the will. The truth that life is suffering should make you want less life. For Nietzsche, illusions that enhance life are valuable, while illusions that diminish life are dangerous, even if they feel like truth. So Schopenhauer's pessimism might be a comfortable lie for weak people who want philosophical justification for giving up. Nietzsche's affirmation might be a necessary illusion for strong people who want to create despite the abyss. Neither is objectively true in a way that transcends human purposes and values. This leaves both philosophies in a strange position. If Schopenhauer is right about truth, then we should all accept pessimism and work toward resignation. If Nietzsche is right about truth, then pessimism and affirmation are both interpretations to be evaluated by their effects on life. But we can't step outside the question to adjudicate it objectively. We're always already inside some interpretation, already committed to some values. The choice between Schopenhauerian pessimism and Nietzschean affirmation can't be settled by appeal to truth, because the status of truth itself is what's at issue. Science, truth, comfortable lies, the questions of whether we can know reality and whether knowing it would help. Schopenhauer trusted that philosophical insight could reveal the thing in itself, and that this revelation, while terrible, was valuable. Nietzsche suspected that what we call truth is always interpretation, and that interpretations should be judged by what they do to us, not by correspondence to reality we can never access anyway. One built a systematic philosophy claiming truth about ultimate reality. The other built a destructive critique questioning whether such truth exists or matters. One said life is suffering, and this is objectively true. The other said life is will to power, and this is a useful interpretation. One wanted truth even though it hurt. The other wanted affirmation even though it might be false. Science sits awkwardly between them. For Schopenhauer, science confirms pessimism by revealing nature's brutality. For Nietzsche, science is one form of will to power, powerful but not privileged, useful but not ultimate. Both philosophers tried to position themselves in relation to the emerging scientific age, but they did so with completely opposite evaluations of what truth is worth and whether having it helps. Schopenhauer wrote extensively about the body, and in his system it has a unique status. The body is the one object you know from two sides. From the outside, like any other object, you perceive it as representation, as thing in space and time with causes and effects. But from the inside, you experience it immediately as will. This is crucial to his argument. How do we know the thing in itself is will? Because we experience our own willing directly in bodily action. You decide to raise your arm, and the arm rises. The willing and the movement aren't two separate events causally connected. They're the same event perceived from two perspectives. The bodily movement is what the will looks like from outside. So the body is your access point to the thing in itself. Through your body, you experience will directly. And this reveals something about all bodies, all objects. If your body is will manifested, then every body, everything is also will manifested. The same force you feel in yourself is working in everything. But this makes the body deeply problematic in Schopenhauer's philosophy. The body is the source of all your suffering. Hunger, pain, sexual desire, all of it comes through the body. The body is how the will has you in its grip. As long as you're embodied, you're driven by bodily needs and wants. And the body doesn't care about your conscious goals or values. It demands food regardless of whether you're trying to contemplate. It demands sleep regardless of whether you're being productive. It desires sex regardless of whether this serves your rational interests. The body is the will asserting itself against consciousness. This is why Schopenhauer's path to wisdom involves denying the body's demands. Fasting, celibacy, mortification, these aren't just arbitrary religious practices. They're direct attacks on the will's hold through the body. By refusing the body's desires, you weaken the will's grip on you. The saint who has achieved complete denial of the will doesn't just think differently, they live differently. They eat minimally, abstain from sex, care nothing for comfort or pleasure. They've reduced bodily existence to the minimum necessary to maintain consciousness. The goal is almost to become pure awareness with as little will as possible. Schopenhauer respects Christian and Buddhist ascetics for understanding this. They saw that the body is the enemy of liberation. As long as you're serving the body's needs, you're serving the will. The only way out is to starve the will by denying the body. This creates a fundamental dualism in his philosophy. Consciousness versus will, mental versus physical, representation versus thing in itself. And the body is uncomfortably in both realms. It's object in representation, but also the immediate expression of will. It's what you perceive and also what you are. Schopenhauer wants consciousness to liberate itself from will, but consciousness depends on a living body, and a living body is will manifested. There's no complete escape except death, And death is just the body's final assertion of will, not its denial. The best you can do is minimize willing while alive, and this means treating the body as necessary evil, keeping it functioning minimally while denying its demands as much as possible. Now hear Nietzsche's response: I am body entirely and nothing beside. This is from Thus Spoke Zarathustra, and it's a direct attack on mind-body dualism, on the entire tradition of treating the body as prison or obstacle or something to be overcome. Nietzsche says consciousness isn't separate from the body, it's a function of the body, one of the body's tools. Everything you call thinking, feeling, willing, all of it is bodily processes. There's no transcendent consciousness that could exist without the body. You are your body, and what you call your mind is just your body thinking. This completely inverts Schopenhauer's framework. For Schopenhauer, the body is the will's trap. For Nietzsche, the body is the self, and consciousness is the body's instrument. The wisdom isn't in denying the body, but in understanding it, listening to it, following its guidance. And Nietzsche has arguments for this. Notice how your clearest thinking happens when your body is healthy. Notice how illness muddles your mind. Notice how what you thought were pure rational decisions turn out to be influenced by fatigue, hunger, sexual frustration. The body is primary, consciousness is derivative. More provocatively, Nietzsche suggests that the ascetic ideal Schopenhauer praises is actually the sick body's revenge on healthy life. People whose bodies are failing, whose instincts aren't working, whose vitality is declining, they create philosophies that make bodily denial into virtue. It's resentment against health disguised as wisdom. The saint who fasts isn't overcoming the will, they're expressing their body's weakness. A truly healthy body doesn't need to be denied because its drives are working properly, pulling the person toward growth and achievement. Only damaged bodies require constant restraint. So when Schopenhauer prescribes bodily denial as the path to wisdom, Nietzsche sees pathology. The whole ascetic program is symptoms of bodily decline rationalized as spiritual achievement. Schopenhauer's body was often sick, often weak. His philosophy of denying the body reflected his personal condition, not metaphysical truth. But Nietzsche goes further. He thinks the body has wisdom that consciousness lacks. The body knows things before the conscious mind figures them out. You meet someone and feel immediate attraction or repulsion. Your body has already evaluated them before your mind has reasons. You hear an argument and feel it's wrong before you can articulate why. Your body knows. This is because the body contains accumulated evolutionary wisdom. Millions of years of successful survival compressed into instinct and intuition. Conscious reason is recent, experimental, often wrong. Bodily wisdom is ancient, tested, usually reliable. The person who trusts their gut over their reasoning is often right to do so. This makes the body not an obstacle to wisdom, but a source of it. Don't deny the body, listen to it. Don't overcome bodily instincts, refine them. Don't treat the body as the will's trap, treat it as life's deepest intelligence. Schopenhauer would say this is precisely the will talking through Nietzsche, making him rationalize bodily drives as wisdom when they're really just blind striving. The body's wisdom is just the will's effective mechanisms for perpetuating itself. Following the body leads deeper into the trap, not out of it. Nietzsche would say Schopenhauer's denial of the body led him to a half-life, cut off from the very energies that make achievement possible. Yes, following the body can lead to dissipation. But denying the body leads to weakness and ultimately to the resentful morality that makes weakness into virtue. The question is whether body and consciousness are enemies or allies. Schopenhauer sees them at war, with consciousness needing to overcome body. Nietzsche sees them as aspects of one process, with consciousness serving body's deeper purposes. And this shows up in their evaluations of health and sickness. Schopenhauer treats bodily health as somewhat irrelevant to philosophical wisdom. The sick person might actually see more clearly because suffering makes the will's trap more obvious. Health just makes you comfortable with existence, which is delusional. Nietzsche treats health as crucial, not because healthy people are morally better, but because health enables creation, achievement, growth. Sickness can teach certain lessons, but ultimately the sick body pulls consciousness toward negation, toward wanting less life. Health pulls toward affirmation, toward wanting more. Both philosophers themselves were often sick. Schopenhauer had periodic health crises, lived in fear of disease. Nietzsche suffered constant pain, eventually collapsed completely. Both wrote philosophy from sick bodies. But Schopenhauer made his sickness into a philosophy of denial. Nietzsche tried to make his sickness into material for affirmation, asking what can be created even in decline. There's something poignant in Nietzsche praising health and bodily vitality, while his own body was failing him. Was he writing what he wished were true? Was he creating an ideal his own sickness prevented him from embodying? Or was he demonstrating that even a sick body can choose ascending values, can affirm life despite pain? Schopenhauer's relationship to his body was simpler. Suppress it, minimize its demands, see through its deceptions. Nietzsche's relationship was more conflicted. Celebrate it even while it betrays you. Find wisdom in it, even when it's failing. Use its energy, even when that energy is depleting. The body problem comes down to whether we're brains trapped in meat, consciousness imprisoned in will, or whether we're sophisticated animals whose consciousness serves bodily purposes. Schopenhauer believed the first, sought escape through denying bodily drives. Nietzsche believed the second, sought achievement through redirecting bodily energy. One wanted consciousness free from the body's demands. The other wanted consciousness aligned with the body's wisdom. One saw the body as obstacle to liberation. The other saw the body as source of power. One prescribed asceticism, denial, withdrawal. The other prescribed vitality, enhancement, creation through bodily energy transmuted. And both were trying to solve the same problem. The body seems to pull us into suffering through its endless needs and vulnerabilities. But Schopenhauer concluded we should resist these pulls toward minimal embodiment. Nietzsche concluded we should harness these pulls toward maximal achievement. Same problematic body, opposite solutions depending on whether you think the body is wise or deluded, friend or enemy, source of life's energy or mechanism of life's trap. Both philosophers looked at conventional morality and saw through it. Neither accepted the moral rules of their age as given truths. Both insisted on asking, where does morality come from? What does it do? Whose interests does it serve? This project of moral criticism unites them. But what they saw beneath morality's surface was completely different. Schopenhauer thought morality, properly understood, must be based on compassion. Why? Because genuine moral action can't come from external rules or selfish calculation. Rules can be followed hypocritically. Selfishness can disguise itself as morality. The only authentic moral motivation is the spontaneous feeling of shared suffering. When you see someone in pain and feel their pain as if it were yours, you're breaking through the illusion of separateness. You're experiencing the metaphysical truth that beneath apparent individuation, we're all manifestations of one will. Compassion is moral because it's true. It recognizes reality while egoism lives in illusion. And from compassion flows Schopenhauer's entire ethics. Don't harm others because their suffering is ultimately your suffering. Help others because relieving their pain is relieving the will's suffering in one of its manifestations. The good person is the compassionate person who has seen through the veil of individuation. But Schopenhauer also thinks most conventional morality is confused. Christian morality commands love of neighbor as if it were duty or divine law. Kant's morality tries to derive ethics from reason alone. Utilitarianism calculates pleasures and pains mathematically. All of these miss the point. Morality can't be commanded or reasoned into. It must flow from genuine insight into the unity of all beings. Still, Schopenhauer respects that conventional morality often gets the right answers, even with wrong reasoning. Don't murder, don't steal, help the poor. These are correct moral rules even if people follow them for mistaken reasons. Compassion-based ethics would reach the same conclusions, but from authentic motivation rather than fear of punishment or hope for reward. And he thinks justice is just the negative side of compassion. Justice means don't harm. Loving kindness means actively help. Both come from recognizing that the other's suffering matters as much as yours because ultimately there is no other, just the one will suffering in different forms. Nietzsche looks at this entire framework and declares it slave morality. His argument goes like this. Morality isn't based on metaphysical insight into the unity of the will. Morality is created by humans to serve human purposes, and different types of humans create different moralities. The question isn't whether a morality is true, but what type of human it serves. There are basically two types, according to Nietzsche, master morality and slave morality. Masters create values from their own abundance. What they affirm in themselves, they call good. What they despise, they call bad. Good means noble, strong, beautiful, powerful. Bad means weak, ugly, contemptible. Slaves, unable to affirm their own qualities, create reactive morality. They start with what they resent in the masters, call it evil, then define good as the opposite. The powerful are evil, therefore the weak are good. The proud are evil, therefore the humble are good. The masters are evil, therefore the slaves are good. This is a complete inversion of values, and it's tremendously successful. Slave morality wins historically because there are always more slaves than masters. Through Christianity especially, slave morality becomes dominant in the West. The meek inherit the earth rhetorically, even if not actually. And Schopenhauer's compassion ethics is just sophisticated slave morality. It takes the Christian valuation of suffering and gives it philosophical justification. It makes the victim's perspective into universal truth. It says the highest human is the one who feels others' pain most deeply, which makes suffering the measure of moral worth. Nietzsche asks, why should we make suffering central to ethics? Only because the suffering predominate and write morality from their perspective. A healthy morality would ask, what enables human excellence? What creates greatness? What allows the exceptional to emerge? And a healthy morality might conclude, some suffering is necessary for growth. Some inequality is necessary for excellence to emerge. Some hardness is necessary for strength. Compassion that prevents all suffering prevents all achievement. Justice that equalizes all differences suppresses all greatness. This doesn't mean Nietzsche advocates cruelty or oppression, but he thinks making compassion the foundation of ethics distorts what morality should do. Morality should enable human flourishing at its highest, not minimize human suffering at its lowest. Schopenhauer would say, this is just the will rationalizing its power drives. Nietzsche wants to justify strength, achievement, nobility, so he creates a morality that values these things. But this ignores the truth. All achievement is just will striving, all pride is just will asserting itself, all excellence is just more elaborate suffering. Nietzsche would say Schopenhauer's compassion ethics comes from weakness unable to achieve, so it makes weakness into virtue. Unable to be strong, Schopenhauer declared strength morally suspect. Unable to create greatly, he declared greatness unnecessary. His entire ethics is resentment disguised as enlightenment. But beyond this personal attack, Nietzsche has a structural argument. Morality based on compassion will inevitably favor the weak over the strong, the declining over the ascending, the failures over the successes, because compassion is specifically triggered by suffering, and the suffering are by definition those who are failing at life. This creates what Nietzsche calls the reversal of values. The morally superior person becomes the one who helps failures continue failing, who preserves weakness, who prevents natural selection from working. Christian charity, socialist equality, democratic leveling, all expressions of this compassion morality that Schopenhauer philosophically endorses. And Nietzsche thinks this is pathological. It pulls culture toward mediocrity. It makes the exceptional feel guilty for excellence. It demands the healthy sacrifice themselves for the sick. This morality might reduce suffering in the short term, but it prevents the greatness that makes existence worth affirming. Here's where the disagreement gets most acute. Schopenhauer thinks reducing suffering is the only rational goal in a world of inevitable suffering. Nietzsche thinks preventing greatness is worse than allowing suffering. One makes suffering reduction the measure of moral worth. The other makes achievement the measure. And they evaluate specific virtues completely differently. Take humility. Schopenhauer values it as recognition that the ego is illusion, that you're not special, that your suffering is everyone's suffering. Humility is seeing through the principium individuationis. Nietzsche sees humility as defeated pride, weakness pretending to be virtue, the inability to affirm yourself disguised as wisdom, or consider compassion itself. Schopenhauer calls it the only genuine moral motivation. Nietzsche calls it a form of contempt, treating the other as so weak they need your pity, denying them the dignity of facing their own challenges. True respect means demanding more from people, not feeling sorry for them. Justice too. Schopenhauer's justice means not harming others because their suffering is your suffering. Nietzsche's justice means giving each what they deserve based on their strength and achievement, which will be unequal because people are unequal. The question becomes, is morality about minimizing suffering or maximizing excellence? And your answer determines everything else. If minimizing suffering, then compassion-based ethics makes sense. If maximizing excellence, then achievement-based ethics makes sense. Schopenhauer would say excellence at the cost of suffering is not worth it. Better to reduce suffering even if this means less achievement. The greatest humans are those who alleviate the most pain. Nietzsche would say suffering without achievement is truly pointless. Better to achieve greatly even if this requires suffering. The greatest humans are those who create the most value. And both thought conventional morality was dishonest, but saw different dishonesty. Schopenhauer thought conventional morality pretended self-interest was virtuous, disguised egoism as duty. Nietzsche thought conventional morality pretended weakness was virtuous, disguised resentment as justice. The morality they each proposed was supposed to be honest. Schopenhauer's compassion ethics honestly acknowledges life is suffering and makes reducing suffering the goal. Nietzsche's excellence ethics honestly acknowledges life is will to power and makes enhancing power the goal. But can either ethics claim objectivity? Schopenhauer says compassion is based on metaphysical truth about the will's unity. Nietzsche says morality is always created by some type of human for some type of purpose. If Nietzsche is right, then Schopenhauer's metaphysics is just another human creation serving the purposes of those who value suffering reduction. If Schopenhauer is right, then Nietzsche's will to power is reality's fundamental nature, and compassion recognizes this more deeply than Nietzsche's ethics does. But how to adjudicate between these frameworks without already being inside one of them? This is the problem Morality Unmasked creates. Once you've seen that morality serves human purposes rather than discovering objective values, you can't unsee it. But then, which purposes to serve? Reducing suffering or enabling greatness? These are different visions of what human life is for. Schopenhauer unmasked conventional morality to reveal compassion underneath. Nietzsche unmasked Schopenhauer's morality to reveal weakness underneath. Both were in the business of genealogy, of tracing morality to its sources, but they traced it to different sources and evaluated those sources oppositely. Morality unmasked becomes morality contested. Is the foundation compassion or power? Is the measure suffering or achievement? Is the goal equality or excellence? Schopenhauer and Nietzsche gave opposite answers to each question while agreeing that conventional morality couldn't answer them honestly. Schopenhauer lived to 72, dying in September 1860 of pulmonary failure. His final years were his first years of real recognition. His essays had found an audience. Younger intellectuals were reading him. He'd finally achieved some of the fame he'd craved his entire career. He died respected, if not celebrated, his mind intact, his philosophy complete. There's a bitter irony here. His philosophy taught that recognition and fame are traps of the will, that the wise person should be indifferent to reputation. Yet Schopenhauer clearly cared desperately about being recognized. He checked reviews obsessively, resented being ignored, celebrated when praise finally came. The man who preached denial of the will spent his life willing recognition, but his mind never wavered. Until the end, he was the same Schopenhauer, pessimistic, brilliant, convinced of his insights, waiting for the world to acknowledge what he'd discovered. His later writing shows no degradation, no confusion, no decline into irrationality. He saw clearly what he'd always seen and expressed it clearly until he stopped. This matters because Schopenhauer's philosophy claims clarity about reality, seeing through illusions to the will beneath, understanding suffering's metaphysical necessity, recognizing that existence is fundamentally problematic. His sanity until death could be read as evidence his philosophy came from clear seeing, not from pathology. Or it could be read differently. Maybe pessimistic resignation is psychologically stable precisely because it demands nothing. You've given up on willing, accepted that existence is suffering, withdrawn from striving. There's no tension, no conflict, no gap between aspiration and achievement. It's peaceful in its way, this philosophical depression masquerading as wisdom. Nietzsche's ending was catastrophically different. In January 1889, in Turin, Italy, something broke. The most common story, though maybe apocryphal, is that Nietzsche saw a horse being whipped in the street, threw his arms around the horse's neck, and collapsed. He was 44 years old. He never recovered. The last decade of his life, from 1889 to his death in 1900, is darkness. He was cared for first by friends, then by his mother, finally by his sister Elizabeth. He didn't write. He didn't think coherently. Whatever had made him Nietzsche was gone. The diagnosis was probably neurosyphilis, though there's still debate. The cause doesn't matter as much as the fact. The philosopher of self-overcoming could not overcome this. And his sister, Elizabeth Forster Nietzsche, took control of his literary estate. She edited his unpublished notes into a book called The Will to Power, arranging fragments to support her own proto-fascist politics. She invited Nazi officials to the Nietzsche archive. She made her brother into something he never was. He had no way to resist because he had no mind left to resist with. There's terrible symmetry here. Nietzsche wrote about the death of God creating an abyss of meaninglessness. Then he fell into an abyss of mindlessness. He wrote about eternal recurrence as the highest affirmation. Then he recurred endlessly through the same few phrases, his mind caught in loops. He wrote about becoming who you are. Then he became nothing, a body without thought, cared for like an infant. Schopenhauer would have said, "This is what happens when you try to affirm the will instead of denying it. The will devours those who serve it most completely." Nietzsche pushed himself to extremes of thinking, writing, creating, and the will broke him. His collapse proves that willing, even willing toward greatness, leads to suffering and destruction. But this seems too easy. Schopenhauer's peaceful death doesn't prove his philosophy right, any more than Nietzsche's collapse proves his philosophy wrong. Correlation isn't causation. Nietzsche probably contracted syphilis in his youth. The disease was working in him for decades before symptoms appeared. His philosophy didn't cause his madness. A spirochete did. Yet there's something haunting in asking, did Nietzsche's philosophy contribute to his psychological vulnerability? He isolated himself deliberately, believing the thinker must be alone. He pushed himself relentlessly, believing greatness requires self-overcoming. He rejected conventional comforts, believing the strong don't need support. Did this make him more fragile when the disease struck? Or differently, does the fact that Nietzsche's mind collapsed invalidate his thought? If a philosophy of strength ends in total weakness, if a philosophy of self-overcoming ends in complete inability to function, if a philosophy of clarity ends in madness, does this reveal something about the philosophy? Schopenhauer's clear-minded resignation until death looks dignified in comparison. He lived according to his philosophy, saw through life's illusions, withdrew from striving, achieved enough denial of the will to die peacefully. His life and death cohere with his thought. Nietzsche's collapse seems like refutation. He couldn't live the affirmation he preached. He couldn't overcome himself into the Übermensch he imagined. He couldn't say yes to eternal recurrence of his actual life, which ended in darkness. His life and death contradict his thought. But maybe this reading is too simple. Maybe Nietzsche was right that pursuing greatness requires risking everything, including sanity. Maybe his collapse was the cost of pushing thought as far as it could go. Maybe he knew this was possible and chose the risk anyway, chose intensity over safety, chose the chance of achievement over the guarantee of preservation. There's a passage in Ecce Homo, written in the months before his collapse, where Nietzsche says, "I am not a man, I am dynamite." He knew something was building in him, some pressure increasing. The book is manic, grandiose, strange. He's calling himself the most important philosopher in history, saying his revaluation of values will split history in two. This is either visionary or delusional or both. Was he already mad when he wrote it? Or was he seeing clearly that what he'd thought was about to explode into culture would eventually transform how humans think about value and meaning? Both might be true. The vision and the madness might be connected, the intensity of thought pushing mind toward places it couldn't safely go. Schopenhauer never risked this. His philosophy was about pulling back from intensity, not pushing toward it. Stay safe, stay rational, see clearly but don't feel too deeply. This preserved his sanity but maybe also limited his achievement. He never pushed thought to the edge because he was too busy constructing safety rails. And there's a question about whether either philosopher achieved what they claimed. Schopenhauer prescribed denial of the will but continued willing until death. He wanted recognition, enjoyed pleasures, lived comfortably. Did he fail to live his philosophy, or was his philosophy impossibly demanding? Nietzsche prescribed self-overcoming and affirmation but collapsed into incapacity. Did he fail to live his philosophy, or did he live it so completely that it destroyed him? Is the gap between aspiration and achievement evidence of hypocrisy or evidence of ambition? Neither philosopher can claim their life validates their thought. Schopenhauer lived too comfortably for a genuine ascetic. Nietzsche ended too broken for a genuine overman. Both fell short of their own ideals. But which failure is more damning? Maybe the failure to push far enough. Schopenhauer saw the truth about suffering but couldn't bring himself to the complete renunciation his truth demanded. He wanted the peace of denial without the sacrifice it required. His philosophy was braver than his life, or maybe the failure to stop soon enough. Nietzsche pushed himself into regions of thought that destroyed the thinker. He sacrificed sanity to philosophy, which might be noble but left him unable to complete the very project that demanded the sacrifice. His life was braver than sustainable thought allows. This becomes a question about philosophy itself. Should philosophy be safe, something you can think without risking your mind? Or should philosophy be dangerous, pushing thought until something breaks? Schopenhauer chose safety and achieved systematic completeness. Nietzsche chose danger and achieved fragmentary brilliance. The madness and clarity question has no clean answer. Schopenhauer's clarity until death could be wisdom or could be caution that prevented deeper insight. Nietzsche's madness could be the price of vision or could be the refutation of his entire project. What remains is the work. Schopenhauer's books sit on shelves, systematic and complete, arguing their pessimistic case. Nietzsche's books and notes sit on shelves, fragmentary and explosive, demanding revaluation. Both bodies of work survived the bodies that created them, and we read both, knowing how each life ended, using that knowledge somehow in evaluating what each thought. The pessimist died peacefully after finally receiving recognition. The tragic optimist died mindless after destroying himself creating. These endings haunt the philosophies in different ways. One ending suggests resignation might be wise after all. The other suggests affirmation might be too costly for humans to sustain. But neither ending settles the philosophical question. Should life be affirmed or denied? The manner of death doesn't determine the truth about life. And both philosophers would probably say their personal fates are irrelevant to their idea's validity. Philosophy should be judged by arguments, not by whether the philosopher embodied what they preached. Yet we can't help asking, did Schopenhauer's peaceful death prove that resignation leads to peace? Did Nietzsche's collapse prove that affirmation leads to destruction? Or is this exactly the wrong way to think about it, treating personal outcomes as evidence for metaphysical claims? Madness and clarity, the two endings to two philosophical lives, leaving us to wonder whether the pessimist's sanity vindicated his vision, or whether the tragic optimist's breakdown was the final affirmation, willing self-destruction rather than comfortable preservation, saying yes even to madness if that's where thinking led. Both Schopenhauer and Nietzsche watched democracy spreading through Europe, and both were horrified. Neither believed in the equality of humans. Neither thought giving political power to the masses would produce good outcomes. Both were, by any modern standard, viciously anti-democratic. But their reasons for opposing democracy came from their different philosophical frameworks and led to different kinds of elitism. Schopenhauer was writing during the revolutionary period of the 1840s. All across Europe, people were demanding constitutions, rights, political participation. He watched revolutions erupt in Paris, Vienna, Berlin, and he hated what he saw. Why? Because the masses are driven by will, by self-interest disguised as ideals about freedom and equality. Revolutionary mobs want power for themselves, not justice or wisdom. Democracy is just the will of the majority trying to dominate the minority. It's organized envy, formalized resentment. Schopenhauer believed in aristocracy, not in the sense of inherited nobility, but in the sense of rule by the genuinely superior. The masses lack the intellectual capacity and moral insight to govern wisely. They're trapped in the world of representation, seeing only surfaces, driven by immediate desires. They can't grasp the deeper truths about existence that should guide policy. Who should rule? In Schopenhauer's ideal, which he never fully articulated, probably a benevolent despot advised by philosophers. Someone with enough power to impose order, but enough wisdom to rule justly. Democracy disperses power to those least qualified to wield it. And he thought democracy would inevitably fail because the masses would vote for whatever promises them immediate gratification. Politicians would pander to base desires. Demagogues would manipulate popular resentment. The result would be chaos, mediocrity, the triumph of quantity over quality. But Schopenhauer's anti-democracy wasn't particularly active. He didn't write political treatises or propose reforms. He just thought politics was mostly pointless because the will would express itself through whatever system humans created. Democracy, monarchy, republic, all of them were just different ways the will organized human conflict. None of them addressed the fundamental problem: existence is suffering. So his attitude toward democracy was contemptuous but resigned. The masses were getting power. This would lead to bad outcomes. But ultimately, it didn't matter much because no political system could solve the metaphysical problem. Better to withdraw from politics entirely and pursue personal denial of the will. Nietzsche's anti-democracy was more urgent and more vicious. He saw democracy as slave morality triumphant. The weak had convinced themselves that their weakness was virtue, that everyone should be equal, that excellence was suspect. And through democracy, they were imposing these values on everyone, pulling culture toward mediocrity. Democracy says all voices should be equal. Nietzsche says this is insane. All voices are not equal. The fool's opinion is not worth the same as the genius's insight. Giving equal political power to unequal people doesn't create justice, it creates tyranny of the mediocre. More specifically, Nietzsche thought democracy was leveling culture, making greatness impossible. In aristocratic ages, inequality was accepted. Some people were exceptional, and resources flowed to them to enable their excellence. In democratic ages, equality is demanded. Anyone exceptional is resented, must be brought down, must prove they're not really superior. This destroys the conditions for cultural achievement. Greatness requires inequality, requires some people having advantages others lack, requires accepting that not everyone can or should reach the same level. Democracy denies this, insists on equal outcomes, and thereby prevents exceptional outcomes. And Nietzsche distinguished between different kinds of democracy, though. There's the democracy of resentment, where the weak use majority power to tear down the strong. And there's potentially a democracy of strong individuals who respect each other's autonomy, a kind of aristocratic democracy. He thought Europe was getting the first kind, though he occasionally hoped for the second. But mostly he saw democracy allied with other forces he opposed. Christianity's equality of souls, socialism's equality of resources, scientific materialism's reduction of humans to mechanisms. All of these denied what Nietzsche thought was obvious. Humans are radically unequal in capacity and value, and culture should cultivate the highest types rather than elevate the lowest. His alternative wasn't a political program exactly. He was suspicious of all mass politics, all systems, all ideologies. He wanted culture that enabled exceptional individuals to emerge and create, but he never specified what political structure would achieve this. Maybe aristocracy, maybe monarchy, maybe something new, but definitely not democracy. And both philosophers worried about what democracy would do to truth. Schopenhauer thought truth was already unpopular, would become more so in democratic ages. The masses don't want to hear that existence is suffering and wisdom is resignation. They want optimistic lies, progress narratives, comforting illusions. Democracy gives power to those who demand comfortable lies, so democratic culture will suppress uncomfortable truths. Nietzsche agreed, but specified differently. Democracy claims all opinions are equally valid, but this makes truth impossible. If the ignorant majority can outvote the knowledgeable minority, then knowledge has no authority. Democratic relativism destroys the possibility of excellence in thought just as democratic equality destroys excellence in culture. Both were writing before full democracy had arrived. Neither lived to see universal suffrage, mass politics in its 20th century form, the complete democratization of culture. They were predicting, warning, describing a future they saw coming and dreaded. Were they right? Has democracy produced the mediocrity and cultural decline they predicted? Or were they just aristocratic snobs unable to accept that the masses deserved political power? This is complicated because both philosophers' predictions partially came true. Democratic culture has leveled certain hierarchies, has made claims to excellence suspect, has given voice to masses of people who lack expertise. Whether this is good or bad depends on your values, which is exactly what's at issue. Schopenhauer would say, look at democratic societies and see that suffering hasn't decreased. Politics hasn't solved the human condition. The masses have power, but still live in illusion, still chase false satisfactions, still suffer the will's trap. Democracy changed nothing fundamental. Nietzsche would say, look at democratic culture and see the mediocrity, the suspicion of greatness, the celebration of equality over excellence. Where are the Goethes, the Beethovens, the cultural titans? Democratic culture produces mass entertainment, not high achievement. But both might be wrong in assuming democracy and excellence are incompatible. Maybe democracy enables different kinds of achievement. Maybe broader participation produces collective advances even if individual genius is less supported. Maybe equality and excellence can coexist if we stop thinking of them as zero-sum. Neither philosopher could imagine this because both thought hierarchically. Excellence must be rare. Resources must concentrate on the few. The many exist to enable the exceptional. This wasn't just prejudice. It followed from their metaphysics. Schopenhauer's will manifests unequally. Nietzsche's will to power creates hierarchy. If you accept their metaphysics, their anti-democracy follows logically. If existence is fundamentally hierarchical, then political equality is fighting reality. But if you reject their metaphysics, their anti-democracy becomes just aristocratic prejudice. The democratic age they witnessed beginning continues accelerating. We live in their feared future, where equality is presumed, where mass opinion has power, where elitism is suspect. And we read their anti-democratic passages with discomfort because we're democratic in ways they never imagined. But their warnings still resonate. Does democracy dumb down culture? Does equality pull toward mediocrity? Does mass politics make wisdom impossible? These questions don't go away just because we value democracy more than they did. Schopenhauer's aristocratic pessimism says, governance doesn't matter much because the human condition is unchangeable. But if you must have government, let the wise few govern rather than the foolish many. Nietzsche's aristocratic activism says, governance matters enormously because culture shapes what humans become, and democratic culture prevents the highest humans from emerging. Different anti-democracies serving different philosophical visions. One withdraws from politics as ultimately futile. The other engages with politics as crucial for culture's future. Both would be appalled by contemporary democracy's complete triumph, but they'd be appalled for different reasons. Schopenhauer because it disproves nothing about suffering. Nietzsche because it prevents the greatness he thought made suffering worthwhile. The democratic age they opposed, the equality they rejected, the masses they feared. Two German philosophers watching the future arrive and seeing disaster. Whether they were right depends on what you value, equality or excellence, justice or greatness, the many or the few. Their anti-democracy forces this choice because they couldn't imagine reconciling the values democracy claims with the values they thought mattered most. Philosophy becomes concrete on a Tuesday afternoon when nothing special is happening and you have to decide how to spend the next few hours. This is where Schopenhauer and Nietzsche stop being abstract systems and become actual guides for living. What do their philosophies actually demand of daily life? Schopenhauer would say, reduce your willing as much as possible. You wake up on Tuesday, you feel desires arising, hunger, ambition, restlessness, the urge to accomplish something, to acquire something, to experience something. His advice is to notice these desires and recognize them for what they are, the will using you for its pointless perpetuation. So you don't indulge every desire, you eat simply, enough to maintain the body, but no gourmet pleasures that intensify attachment to sensual satisfaction. You don't pursue ambitious projects that will just create new anxieties and disappointments. You don't fill the day with stimulation and entertainment that keeps the will churning. What do you do instead? Ideally, you contemplate. You might look at art, listen to music, read philosophy or literature. These activities quiet the will temporarily by allowing consciousness to become absorbed in perception without wanting anything from what you perceive. You're not trying to get anything, you're just aware. Or you might practice deliberate simplification. Meditation, though Schopenhauer didn't use that term exactly, but the idea is similar. Sitting quietly, observing thoughts without following them, letting desires arise and pass without acting on them. Training consciousness to separate from the will's demands. If you must act, you act with minimal investment. You do what's necessary to maintain life, but don't elaborate unnecessarily. You help others who are suffering because compassion is the only authentic moral motivation. But you don't build grand schemes to change the world because the world's fundamental nature can't change. The ideal Tuesday afternoon, by Schopenhauer's standard, would be spent reading in a quiet room, perhaps listening to chamber music, eating a simple meal, taking a walk in nature without any goal beyond the walking itself, maybe writing a few thoughts but without ambition for recognition. It's a life of cultivation and withdrawal. And crucially, you're training yourself for the larger project, progressive detachment from the will. Each day you practice wanting less, needing less, being disturbed by less. You're not trying to achieve anything in the ordinary sense. You're trying to dissolve the achieving impulse itself. This sounds peaceful, and it can be. There's relief in not striving, in accepting that you don't need to make your mark or accomplish great things. But there's also the question, is this living or is this waiting to die? Schopenhauer would say the question reveals your attachment to the will. If you need life to feel purposeful and intense, you're still trapped. Now imagine Nietzsche's Tuesday afternoon. You wake up with energy or you wake up exhausted, doesn't matter. The question is, what are you going to do with yourself today? Not in the sense of obligations, but in the sense of self-creation. Every day is an opportunity to become more who you are or to slip into who you're not. Nietzsche would say, find something difficult and do it. Not difficult because it's unpleasant, difficult because it requires your full capacity and pushes you slightly beyond current limits. This might be intellectual work, physical training, artistic creation, any activity where you're overcoming resistance. The point isn't relaxation or peace. The point is growth through struggle. You're using Tuesday afternoon to make yourself stronger, more capable, more refined. You're treating your life as material to be shaped, yourself as a project under construction. So maybe you're writing and it's hard and you want to stop, and you don't stop because pushing through the difficulty is where the transformation happens. Or you're learning something new and it's frustrating, and the frustration is evidence you're actually stretching capacity rather than just repeating what you already know. Or maybe you're engaging in deliberate self-examination. Nietzsche kept notebooks where he worked out ideas, questioned his own assumptions, experimented with perspectives. He'd spend afternoons writing aphorisms, trying to compress insights into dense, memorable form. This is active rather than receptive, creating rather than contemplating. And when you're not working, you're not just resting, you're experiencing intensely. You take a walk, but you're paying attention to everything, alive to sensation, using the walk to clarify thinking rather than escape thinking. You eat, but you're tasting deliberately, enjoying the experience fully rather than consuming absently. Nietzsche would also say, be selective about what enters your consciousness. Don't read newspapers filled with mediocrity and current events that don't matter. Don't surround yourself with people who pull you toward comfortable weakness. Curate your inputs like you're curating a museum, keeping only what elevates. The ideal Tuesday afternoon by Nietzsche's standard would be spent creating something, overcoming some difficulty, refining some capacity, then celebrating the effort with intense experience of whatever pleasures you allow yourself. It's a life of constant becoming, never settled, always in motion toward the next version of yourself. But this is also exhausting. There's no rest in Nietzsche's vision, no peace, no moment where you can say, I've arrived and stop struggling. Every achievement creates a new challenge. Every success demands a new overcoming. Is this heroic or is this torture? Nietzsche would say, if it feels like torture, you're not strong enough yet. The person who's truly becoming themselves experiences this constant striving as joy, as their nature expressing itself. Only the weak experience growth as burden. So here are two completely different Tuesday afternoons. Schopenhauer's, quiet, contemplative, deliberately simple, focused on reducing desire and cultivating detachment. Nietzsche's, intense, active, deliberately challenging, focused on increasing capacity and cultivating strength. Both require discipline. Schopenhauer's path requires discipline to resist the constant pull of new desires. It's hard to stay simple, to not want more, to not get caught up in projects and ambitions. The will is always trying to reassert itself. Nietzsche's path requires discipline to keep pushing against resistance. It's hard to choose difficulty over ease, to stay in the discomfort of growth, to not collapse into comfortable mediocrity. The temptation toward resignation is always there, but they're opposite disciplines. One is training yourself to want less. The other is training yourself to demand more of yourself. One is cultivating peace through withdrawal. The other is cultivating intensity through engagement. And both philosophers would say most people do neither. Most people drift through Tuesday afternoon, half pursuing desires that don't satisfy, half avoiding challenges that might transform them. They watch television, scroll through distractions, engage in social performances, consume without creating, want without achieving. They're living neither philosophy, just existing in the default mode both philosophers despised. Schopenhauer would look at ordinary Tuesday afternoons and see the will churning mindlessly. People shopping for things they don't need, gossiping about trivialities, chasing little pleasures and avoiding little pains, the whole apparatus of modern life designed to keep willing without ever satisfying, its suffering disguised as living. Nietzsche would look at the same afternoons and see waste, all that human potential, all that energy, spent on nothing that matters. People could be creating, growing, becoming, but instead they're consuming entertainment and pursuing comfort. It's life diminished to mere existence. Both would say, you're free Tuesday afternoon to choose how to live. Most people don't realize they're choosing. They just do what feels natural, what everyone else does, what requires least resistance. This unconscious choosing is exactly what both philosophers wanted to interrupt. Schopenhauer wants to make you conscious of your willing so you can choose to will less. Notice the desire arising, recognize it as will, let it pass without acting. Do this repeatedly, and you're practicing the denial of will that might eventually become stable. Nietzsche wants to make you conscious of your potential so you can choose to actualize more of it. Notice the easy path, recognize it as decline into mediocrity, choose the harder path that builds capacity. Do this repeatedly, and you're practicing the self-overcoming that might eventually become your nature. The Tuesday afternoon question is, are you living deliberately or drifting? Both philosophies demand deliberateness, but toward opposite ends. One demands deliberate simplification. The other demands deliberate intensification. And you can't do both simultaneously. You can't be reducing desires while cultivating new ambitions. You can't be withdrawing from striving while pushing toward achievement. The two paths diverge completely, and Tuesday afternoon forces the choice. Most people want some middle path. Some ambition, but not too much. Some peace, but not too much. Balanced life with achievement and rest in equal measure. Both Schopenhauer and Nietzsche would say this middle path is evasion. You're trying to avoid the real question. Is life something to maximize or minimize? To affirm or deny? To expand or contract? There's no moderate position that satisfies the logic of either philosophy. Schopenhauer's logic leads to renunciation. Nietzsche's logic leads to constant self-overcoming. Half measures don't work because the fundamental question doesn't admit half answers. So what do you actually do on Tuesday afternoon? The question isn't academic. It's the question every actual Tuesday afternoon when you have freedom to choose how to spend time. And your pattern of choices, accumulated over hundreds of Tuesday afternoons, becomes your life. Choose Schopenhauer's path and you'll live quietly, detached, at peace maybe, increasingly indifferent to outcomes, focused on consciousness rather than action. You might achieve serenity. You might also wonder sometimes if you're really living or just existing minimally. Choose Nietzsche's path and you'll live intensely, engaged, in constant motion, always pushing limits, focused on creation and achievement. You might achieve greatness. You might also exhaust yourself, collapse from the constant demand for more. Choose neither path consciously and you'll drift, which both would say is the worst option. At least if you choose deliberately, you're living according to some vision of what life should be. Drifting means you're living according to no vision, just reacting, just consuming, just passing time until time runs out. The Tuesday afternoon test reveals which philosophy, if either, actually guides your life. Not what you profess to believe, but how you actually spend the ordinary hours when no one's watching and nothing special is happening. Are you cultivating detachment or intensity, peace or growth, withdrawal or engagement? And maybe the honest answer for most people is neither consistently. Some days you try to simplify and reduce wanting. Other days you push yourself toward achievement. You're inconsistent because you haven't really decided the fundamental question both philosophers force: should life be affirmed or denied? But the question keeps coming back every Tuesday afternoon: what are you doing and why? Are you living deliberately towards some vision of human excellence or human wisdom? Or are you just filling time between birth and death with whatever seems pleasant or necessary in the moment? Schopenhauer and Nietzsche both insist you must answer. And your answer shows itself not in what you say, but in what you do when you're free to do anything, when it's Tuesday afternoon and the hours stretch ahead and you have to choose. Both philosophers died more than a century ago, Schopenhauer in 1860, Nietzsche in 1900, but their shadows extend into our present, shaping how we think even when we don't know we're thinking their thoughts. The question is, which shadow has proven longer, darker, more inescapable? Schopenhauer's influence flowed in specific channels. He shaped artistic culture first, before academic philosophy accepted him. Wagner we've discussed, but he influenced other composers too. Mahler read Schopenhauer, and you can hear the pessimistic longing in his symphonies. Richard Strauss, same thing. The entire late Romantic musical tradition has Schopenhauerian DNA. Beauty created in full knowledge of suffering, art as temporary transcendence, the sense that life's depths are tragic. Writers followed. Thomas Mann built his novel Buddenbrooks around Schopenhauerian decline. Tolstoy read Schopenhauer and found confirmation of what he already felt about desire creating suffering. Proust, though he deny it, structures In Search of Lost Time around Schopenhauerian themes: the will as suffering, memory as escape from time, art as salvation from life's futility. Even Beckett, though he's 20th century, has Schopenhauer in his bones. Waiting for Godot is pure Schopenhauerian stasis. We wait, nothing happens, we're still waiting. Existence is this waiting without purpose or end. The pessimistic modernism of the mid-20th century often unknowingly channels Schopenhauer. But Schopenhauer's biggest impact was on Freud, though indirectly. Freud never acknowledged the debt fully, but psychoanalysis is Schopenhauerian will translated into psychological terms. The unconscious driving consciousness, irrational forces beneath rational surface, desire creating conflict and suffering, the impossibility of complete satisfaction. Change the terms from metaphysical to psychological and you get Freud from Schopenhauer. And through Freud, Schopenhauer's ideas saturated 20th century culture. The notion that we're driven by unconscious forces, that reason is secondary to irrational drives, that satisfaction is temporary and desire endless, these became common sense. Schopenhauer's pessimism became the educated person's default assumption about human nature. In academic philosophy, Schopenhauer influenced the pessimistic strain that runs through existentialism. Not Sartre exactly, but the darker existentialists, the ones who emphasized absurdity and meaninglessness. Camus's Sisyphus is Schopenhauerian, endless striving without purpose, and the only response is to imagine Sisyphus happy, to affirm the absurd, though even this affirmation has Schopenhauerian resignation in it. Contemporary pessimism, the philosophical movement that includes figures like Eugene Thacker and Thomas Ligotti, explicitly claims Schopenhauer as founder. They've revived his arguments about suffering being built into existence, his critique of optimism, his vision of consciousness as curse rather than blessing. Pessimism as philosophical position owes everything to Schopenhauer. And in popular culture, though people don't know the name, Schopenhauerian themes appear constantly. The sense that desire never satisfies, that achievement feels empty, that hedonic adaptation means pleasure fades quickly. Self-help literature is often unconscious. Schopenhauerianism: reduce attachment, practice mindfulness, accept what you can't change. Buddhism's Western popularization succeeded partly because Schopenhauer had prepared the ground. His shadow is steady rather than dramatic. It's the background assumption that life is difficult, that suffering is normal, that wisdom means adjusting expectations downward. It's the therapeutic attitude: manage your suffering, reduce your desires, find peace through acceptance. Modern Western culture, for all its optimistic rhetoric, has absorbed Schopenhauer's pessimism deeply. Now watch Nietzsche's shadow, which is more explosive and more contested. He influenced 20th century philosophy more directly and more violently than Schopenhauer. Existentialism is unthinkable without him. Sartre, Camus, Heidegger, all responding to Nietzsche's challenge to create meaning in a meaningless universe. The death of God became existentialism's starting point. The demand to create values became its project. Postmodernism claimed Nietzsche as ancestor. Foucault's genealogical method comes from Nietzsche. Derrida's deconstruction has Nietzschean elements in its suspicion of truth and emphasis on interpretation. The whole postmodern project of questioning grand narratives, revealing power beneath apparent neutrality, treating truth as construction rather than discovery, this is Nietzschean. Feminist theory has complicated relationship with Nietzsche. He said terrible things about women, but his critique of fixed identities and stable essences enabled feminist arguments about gender as performance, as construction, as something that can be reimagined and recreated. The Nietzschean move of asking whose interests a category serves gets used against categories Nietzsche himself never questioned. In politics, Nietzsche's shadow is darkest and most controversial. The Nazis claimed him, horribly and wrongly but effectively. Elizabeth's editing and promotion made Nietzsche into a prophet of German supremacy and will to power as brute force. This association took decades to undo and isn't fully undone even now. But Nietzsche also influenced anti-totalitarian thought. Isaiah Berlin's emphasis on value pluralism has Nietzschean roots. Ayn Rand's objectivism, though she deny it, is vulgar Nietzsche. The whole 20th century conversation about whether might makes right, whether power is the fundamental reality beneath moral claims, happens in Nietzsche's terms even when reaching anti-Nietzschean conclusions. In psychology, Nietzsche influenced very differently than Schopenhauer. Where Schopenhauer led to Freud's emphasis on unconscious drives and their management, Nietzsche led to humanistic psychology's emphasis on self-actualization. Maslow's hierarchy, with self-actualization at the peak, is secularized Nietzschean becoming. The idea that you should become your authentic self rather than conform to external expectations comes from Nietzsche. Contemporary self-improvement culture is often distorted Nietzsche. The emphasis on constant growth, on pushing limits, on overcoming obstacles, on creating your own meaning, this is Nietzscheanism filtered through capitalism. It's been stripped of Nietzsche's critique of mass culture and reduced to personal optimization, but the bones are his. In popular culture, Nietzsche appears as edgy villain or tough-minded realist. Comic book anti-heroes channel distorted Nietzscheanism. The Joker's nihilism, various supervillains' will to power, the whole aesthetic of transgression and breaking rules has Nietzschean overtones. This is mostly misunderstanding, but it shows cultural impact. More authentically, Nietzsche influenced the counterculture movements. The 1960s emphasis on authenticity, on breaking conventional morality, on creating your own values rather than inheriting them. This was often shallow Nietzsche, but it was Nietzsche. The idea that the previous generation's values don't automatically bind you, that you can and should question everything. This became common sense through Nietzsche's influence. And in contemporary philosophy, Nietzsche remains absolutely central to debates about truth, morality, meaning. Can there be values after the death of God? Is all perspective interpretation? Does power underlie every claim to truth? These Nietzschean questions structure contemporary thought in ways impossible to escape. So whose shadow is longer? Schopenhauer's steady pessimism or Nietzsche's explosive revaluation? One measure is academic philosophy. Philosophy departments teach Nietzsche extensively, often entire courses on him. Schopenhauer appears less frequently, usually as background to Nietzsche or as influence on other thinkers. By this measure, Nietzsche's shadow is longer. Another measure is therapeutic culture. The widespread emphasis on accepting what you can't change, reducing desire, finding peace through detachment. This is Schopenhauerian even when it doesn't know it. By this measure, Schopenhauer's shadow is longer. Political philosophy has been more shaped by Nietzsche, for better and worse. The 20th century's totalitarian nightmares and its liberation movements both claimed Nietzschean rhetoric. The debates about power, equality, excellence all happen in Nietzschean terms. Schopenhauer barely appears in political theory. But popular pessimism, the sense that modern life is empty despite material abundance, that success doesn't satisfy, that something's wrong with constant striving, this is Schopenhauerian. Even the most optimistic self-help includes Schopenhauerian assumptions about hedonic adaptation and desire's endless nature. Perhaps the real answer is that both shadows are long but illuminate different territories. Schopenhauer's shadow falls over questions of suffering, desire, satisfaction, the therapeutic dimension of human life. Nietzsche's shadow falls over questions of meaning, value, truth, the creative dimension of human life, and they interact. The person who reads both often finds themselves torn between Schopenhauerian acceptance and Nietzschean striving. The culture that absorbed both often contradicts itself, preaching both contentment and achievement, both peace and growth, both acceptance and transformation. Contemporary life is lived in the tension between these philosophies. We're told to reduce stress and pursue success, accept yourself and improve yourself, find peace and achieve greatness, be content with less and strive for more. These contradictions are Schopenhauer and Nietzsche fighting in our cultural consciousness. The therapeutic ethos says, life is suffering, reduce your desires, find peace through acceptance. This is Schopenhauer domesticated, made gentle, stripped of its radical renunciation, but keeping its core insight about desire causing suffering. The achievement ethos says, life is opportunity, maximize your potential, find meaning through creation. This is Nietzsche domesticated, made safe, stripped of its dangerous revaluation, but keeping its core insight about self-overcoming. Most people try to live both philosophies simultaneously, without realizing they're contradictory. They want peace and greatness, acceptance and achievement, both the serenity of non-attachment and the intensity of full engagement. This creates the characteristic anxiety of contemporary life. The sense that however you're living is wrong, that you should be both more ambitious and more content, both striving harder and accepting more. Both philosophers would say you can't have it both ways. Either life is something to minimize through detachment or maximize through creation. Either existence is fundamentally suffering to escape or fundamentally power to enhance. The middle path both would reject as evasion. But their long shadows don't give us the luxury of choice. We live in culture saturated with both visions. Schopenhauer's pessimism is in our therapeutic assumptions. Nietzsche's affirmation is in our achievement imperatives. We can't simply choose one and ignore the other because both are built into how we think. The question becomes, can we live the tension consciously rather than just suffering it? Can we understand that these are two coherent but incompatible visions of human life and choose deliberately between them rather than trying impossibly to synthesize them? Or maybe the tension itself is productive. Maybe Schopenhauer prevents Nietzschean striving from becoming destructive mania. Maybe Nietzsche prevents Schopenhauerian acceptance from becoming passive resignation. Maybe the argument between them, continuing in culture long after both are dead, is more useful than either philosophy alone. Their long shadows meet and overlap in contemporary consciousness. We feel Schopenhauer's pessimism about desire while feeling Nietzsche's demand for meaning creation. We're suspended between resignation and affirmation, between acceptance and transformation, between the wisdom of wanting less and the courage of becoming more. And perhaps that's the ultimate legacy. Not that one was right and one was wrong, not that one shadow eclipsed the other, but that they defined the space where modern people live. Between the pessimist who said life is suffering to be denied and the tragic optimist who said life is will to power to be affirmed, between the philosopher who prescribed withdrawal and the philosopher who demanded creation, we make our choices about what to do with existence. Their shadows are long because their questions remain unanswered. Should life be affirmed or denied? Is suffering evidence that existence is a mistake or the price of significance? Should wisdom mean reducing desire or enhancing capacity? Should we seek peace through detachment or meaning through striving? We're still asking, still torn, still living in the space their philosophies carved out. Schopenhauer taught us to see through optimistic illusions. Nietzsche taught us to create in the void those illusions exposed. Together, they made modern consciousness possible, aware of meaninglessness but demanding meaning anyway, seeing through everything but having to live as if something matters, knowing the foundations are gone but building on ruins because what else can we do? The long shadow isn't one or the other. It's both, overlapping, creating the peculiar darkness and light we inhabit, where nothing is certain but choices must be made, where suffering is real but affirmation is possible, where the pessimist's clear sight and the tragic optimist's brave creation contend for our souls every Tuesday afternoon when we have to decide what to do with another few hours of being alive.